At a family dinner, my son-in-law's father grabbed my 9-year-old grandson by the collar and slammed him into the wall over a spilled glass of wine. His wife smiled and said the boy needed to learn a lesson. My blood ran completely cold. I stood up and made one single phone call. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I am Gerald, 69 years old, and the quiet architect of my own empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to systematically dismantle arrogant people who mistook your silence for weakness. I sat at the far end of a massive mahogany dining table inside Mitchell's sprawling suburban mansion. The room smelled of expensive cologne and roasted lamb. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh bright light over the sterile room. I wore a faded red flannel shirt and a pair of worn work boots. I stuck out like a sore thumb among the tailored silk suits and glittering diamond jewelry. Mitchell was a wealthy white real estate mogul. At least that was the image he desperately projected to the world. He sat at the head of the table swirling a glass of imported wine. He spent the entire first course mocking my old Ford pickup truck parked in his pristine circular driveway. He asked loudly if I needed him to call a tow truck to get that pile of rust off his property before the neighbors complained. I ate my dinner in complete silence. My daughter Naomi sat across from me. She forced a painful, tight smile, trying desperately to appease her in-laws. I could see the deep exhaustion in her eyes. My son-in-law Logan laughed loudly at his father's jokes. Logan was a 36-year-old man who worked under his father and possessed no spine of his own. He eagerly joined in on the mockery to secure a shred of approval from his dad. Logan leaned across the table and made a snide remark about how blue-collar labor ruins a man's posture and intellect. He asked if my hands were always that calloused and rough. I sliced my lamb and chewed my food methodically. Evelyn, my late wife, always told me that true power never needs to raise its voice. I kept my word to her. I maintained a low profile and protected my bloodline from the shadows. Mitchell and his arrogant family assumed I was just a retired mechanic surviving on a meager pension and government handouts. They did not know I was the founder and primary shareholder of the largest commercial real estate trust in the state. I let them laugh. I let them build their false sense of superiority. I knew the exact financial leverage I held over their lives. The tone of the room shifted in a fraction of a second. My 9-year-old grandson Leo reached across the wide table to grab a dinner roll. His small elbow brushed against a tall crystal glass of red wine. The glass tipped forward and crashed onto the floor, spilling a dark crimson stain across Mitchell's prized Persian rug. The dining room fell dead silent. The sound of the shattering crystal seemed to suck all the air out of the space. Leo gasped and shrank back into his heavy wooden chair. Mitchell's face flushed a deep, violent purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. He slammed his heavy fists on the table, causing the silverware to rattle, and lunged out of his seat. Before anyone could even blink, Mitchell grabbed Leo by the collar of his shirt. He yanked the small boy out of his chair with terrifying force and slammed him hard against the dining room wall. The sickening thud of my grandson's back hitting the solid drywall echoed through the silent room. Leo cried out in sudden pain and pure terror. Patricia, Mitchell's wife, calmly took a slow sip of her wine. She set her delicate glass down and loudly declared that the boy needed strict discipline. She smiled a cold, wicked smile and stated that it was about time someone taught him proper manners. I looked sharply at Logan. My cowardly son-in-law stared down at his half-eaten plate. He refused to intervene. He allowed his own son to be physically assaulted by his father just to keep the peace. Naomi froze in pure terror. Her hands gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning stark white under the chandelier light. She was completely paralyzed by years of psychological conditioning and systemic fear. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy and cold. Mitchell held my grandson pinned against the wall, breathing heavily and muttering nasty insults about the boy's clumsiness and lack of breeding. He fully expected everyone at that table to simply accept this horrific display of physical violence. He expected the poor black grandfather in the flannel shirt to lower his head and submit to his absolute authority. I stood up from my chair. I did not yell. I did not flip the table or curse at them. I walked calmly and deliberately toward Mitchell. My heavy work boots echoed with a dangerous finality on the polished hardwood floor. Mitchell turned his head to look at me, a disgusted sneer forming on his lips. I reached out and clamped my calloused right hand over his pristine wrist. I applied a precise, crushing pressure, targeting the nerves until his fingers instinctively released my grandson's collar. Mitchell gasped in sudden pain and took a frantic step back, rubbing his wrist in complete shock. I pulled Leo safely behind me, shielding him with my body. I placed my hand gently on the boy's trembling shoulder to reassure him that he was safe. I looked directly into Mitchell's eyes. I let him see the absolute lack of fear and the raw, calculated danger in mine. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans and pulled out my battered cell phone. I dialed a highly secure private number that I knew by heart. The line picked up on the very first ring. It was Jonathan Hayes, my personal corporate lawyer and the managing director of my massive trust fund. I spoke clearly and coldly into the receiver, making sure my voice carried across the silent dining room. Execute protocol Titan immediately. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I took Leo firmly by the hand and guided him toward the front door. Naomi remained frozen in her chair, unable to process the swift and terrifying shift in reality. Logan finally looked up, his mouth hanging open in dumbfounded silence. Mitchell yelled after me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing in his house and threatening to call the police on me. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and led my grandson down the stone steps toward my rusty pickup truck. The cool night air hit my face, but my focus remained razor sharp. That single phone call to Jonathan Hayes was not an idle threat or an empty gesture. It was a tactical financial strike. It instantly activated a lethal corporate protocol targeting Mitchell's primary holding company. The glamorous facade of their wealthy empire was about to be systematically dismantled brick by brick. The heavy pounding on my solid oak front door shattered the quiet of the early morning. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and wiped my hands on a towel. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that wood. I unlocked the deadbolt and swung the heavy door open. Logan stood on my front porch. His expensive designer suit jacket was wrinkled and his face was flushed with frantic anger. He did not bother to greet me. He immediately demanded that I pick up my phone and call his father. Logan ordered me to beg Mitchell for forgiveness for walking out of the dinner party the night before. He waved his hands frantically in the air, acting as if my silent departure had caused a catastrophic social disaster. Logan stepped closer, attempting to use his height to intimidate me. He told me I was an ungrateful old man who had no concept of how high society worked. He sneered at my faded jeans and the dusty boots resting by the door. Logan stated that his family had generously allowed me into their home out of pure pity. He claimed my behavior was an embarrassment to Naomi and a prime example of why blue-collar workers do not belong at elite tables. He ordered me to swallow my foolish pride. Logan insisted that his father was a highly respected real estate mogul who deserved absolute obedience from a retired mechanic like me. I listened to his frantic rant without changing my expression. Every insult he threw at me only confirmed what I already knew about his weak character. Logan was a man terrified of losing his allowance. He survived entirely on the scraps his father threw at him, and he expected everyone else to bow down to the same master. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest and raised his voice. Logan gave me exactly 10 minutes to make the phone call. He threatened to make my life miserable if I refused to comply with his strict demands. He believed he held all the power in this situation. He assumed my silence was a sign of total submission. I looked at the panicked sweat forming on his forehead. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and prepared to give my response. I stepped out onto the wooden planks of my porch and closed the front door behind me. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine trees, but my mind was entirely focused on the coward standing in front of me. I looked at Logan and remembered the solemn promise I made to my late wife. Evelyn held my hand on her deathbed and made me swear to protect our bloodline against any incoming threat. She knew the world could be cruel to a child, and she trusted me to be the absolute shield for our family. I was not about to break that vow for a pathetic man who let his own son get slammed into a solid wall. I stepped directly into Logan's personal space, forcing him to take an involuntary step backward. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with quiet, absolute authority. I told him I would never apologize to a man who puts his hands on a child. I ordered Logan to go home, pack my grandson's bags, and bring Leo to my cabin immediately. I made it clear that Leo would be staying with me until I decided otherwise. Logan stared at me in total disbelief. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed across the empty yard. He quickly regained his arrogant posture and pushed his shoulders back. Logan told me I had completely lost my mind. He proudly declared that he was the father and he held all the legal rights. He promised to hire the most expensive lawyers in the city to ban me from ever seeing Naomi or Leo again. Logan swore he would file a restraining order before noon, claiming I was an unstable and dangerous old man. He looked at my modest cabin and laughed loudly again. He asked how a broke mechanic could ever afford to fight a wealthy family in family court. Logan believed his money made him untouchable. He believed the justice system would automatically favor his pristine white-collar image over my calloused hands. He sneered and told me to enjoy my miserable, lonely life because my grandson was completely out of my reach. He turned his back on me with a dramatic sweep of his expensive jacket. He marched toward his luxury sports car parked on my gravel driveway, absolutely convinced he had won the war. Logan grabbed the handle of his sports car, but before he could open the door, his cell phone emitted a loud, sharp chime. It was a high-priority emergency alert. I watched closely from the porch as he pulled the device from his tailored pocket. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he read the notification on his screen. He shook his head, dismissed the text message, and climbed into the driver's seat. He revved the engine aggressively, spinning his tires on the loose gravel to show his contempt before speeding off down the road. Logan drove straight to the premium gas station located at the corner of the busy highway. I knew exactly what was about to happen because I had personally authorized the financial strike the night before. Logan pulled up to the pump and swiped his exclusive black credit card. The small digital screen instantly flashed a bright red error message. The transaction was firmly declined. Frustrated, he pulled out a second premium card from his expensive leather wallet. He swiped it again with heavy force. The screen flashed the exact same red warning. The machine instructed him to contact his financial institution immediately. Logan stormed into the convenience store, assuming the outdoor machine was simply broken. He threw his items on the counter and handed the cashier his premium card. The cashier swiped it through the register and shook his head, handing it back. The cashier informed Logan that the account had 0 available funds. Logan turned completely pale. He stepped outside into the cold air and frantically dialed his private banking concierge. I had orchestrated this exact sequence of devastating events. The bank representative on the other end of the line delivered the crushing news. The representative informed Logan that every single personal and business account tied to his name was completely frozen. A massive corporate debt recall had been triggered overnight by their primary holding trust. The bank explained that they were legally obligated to seize all available liquid assets to cover the immediate default. Logan screamed into the phone, demanding to speak to the highest branch manager. The representative coldly stated that the local manager could not reverse a supreme executive order. Logan stood by his luxury car holding a useless piece of plastic. The immense wealth he just used to threaten me had vanished into thin air. The first heavy chain of the conflict locked firmly into place. Mitchell parked his silver Porsche in his reserved VIP spot just outside his luxury real estate headquarters. He adjusted his silk tie and strode toward the entrance, fully expecting a normal day of commanding his subordinates and closing lucrative deals. He reached for the heavy brass handles of the automatic double doors, but they did not yield. He pulled harder, his shoulder bumping aggressively against the thick glass. A massive industrial steel padlock secured the handles tightly together. Mitchell took a confused step backward. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of red as he noticed a bright orange legal notice aggressively glued directly to the center of the pristine glass. A dozen of his top real estate agents stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, holding their briefcases and murmuring among themselves. Mitchell felt a hot, sickening spike of public humiliation. He grabbed the edge of the orange paper and tried to tear it off, but the industrial adhesive held firm against his manicured fingernails. The document bore a heavy legal seal stating clearly that all business operations within the commercial suite were suspended immediately. He pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket, his hands shaking with absolute fury. He dialed the direct emergency line to the high-end building management firm. He paced back and forth in front of his staring employees, screaming violently into the receiver. He demanded to know who had the sheer audacity to lock him out of his own corporate headquarters. He threatened to sue the management company into bankruptcy for disrupting his multi-million-dollar empire. He reminded them that his rent was paid in full, and he was their most prestigious tenant. Mitchell expected frantic apologies and immediate compliance. He expected the building manager to rush down to the street level with a set of keys and a groveling excuse. He was completely unprepared for the chilling, unapologetic reality waiting for him on the other end of the line. The building manager did not offer a single apology. His voice was deadpan and cold, entirely devoid of the usual subservience Mitchell demanded from the working class. The manager informed Mitchell that the commercial property had been aggressively acquired in an overnight corporate buyout. A massive, unnamed real estate trust had purchased the entire high-rise building with a blind cash wire transfer just hours after his dinner party ended. Mitchell yelled that a sudden change in building ownership did not automatically invalidate his existing commercial lease. The manager calmly corrected his flawed legal assumption. The new majority shareholder had ordered an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of all tenant contracts before sunrise. The legal audit team discovered a highly specific, carefully hidden breach of contract clause that Mitchell had flagrantly ignored for years. He had illegally sublet a portion of the basement storage floor to an unverified third-party vendor to pocket extra cash. The previous management had looked the other way in exchange for under-the-table perks. The new ownership possessed zero tolerance for contract violations. The manager stated that the eviction was perfectly legal, executed with absolute judicial precision and entirely non-negotiable. Mitchell screamed that he desperately needed access to his internal servers, his confidential client files, and his physical checkbooks. He demanded a standard 30-day grace period to relocate his massive firm. The manager flatly denied the desperate request. He told Mitchell that his legal team would be contacted regarding a strictly scheduled retrieval of personal items under armed security supervision. The line abruptly went dead. Mitchell stood frozen on the busy downtown sidewalk. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered harshly against the concrete. He stared blankly at his brass company logo shining uselessly behind the locked glass. His entire business operation was effectively paralyzed with a single unyielding stroke of invisible corporate power. Miles away from the downtown chaos, the quiet morning air at my wooden cabin was broken by the heavy crunch of tires on gravel. A sleek, bulletproof black sedan pulled into my dirt driveway, stopping precisely next to my rusted Ford pickup truck. Jonathan Hayes stepped out into the morning sun. He was a high-powered corporate lawyer who charged thousands of dollars an hour, yet he always treated my humble porch with the utmost reverence. Jonathan walked into my modest kitchen carrying a thick, unmarked leather folder. I poured him a cup of dark black coffee from my old stovetop percolator. He did not care about the chipped ceramic mug. He cared about the financial war we were actively waging against an abusive family. Jonathan placed the heavy folder onto my scratched dining table and slid it carefully toward me. He flipped open the cover to reveal a stack of pristine, terrifying legal documents. These papers were not related to the commercial office building takeover. They were the original mortgage notes for Mitchell's sprawling suburban mansion. Jonathan explained the brilliant vulnerability he had uncovered during the night. Mitchell had quietly taken out a massive high-interest second mortgage against his personal home to secretly fund his failing business ventures. The debt was severely over-leveraged and held by a predatory private lending firm. Under my direct orders from the night before, Jonathan had used my trust fund's immense liquid capital to buy out that exact debt portfolio at a premium price. My trust now officially owned the financial paper on the very house where Mitchell had violently assaulted my grandson. Jonathan reached into his tailored jacket and handed me a solid gold fountain pen. He pointed to the bottom line of a freshly drafted legal demand letter. The document invoked a specific acceleration clause hidden deep in the original loan terms. The clause required Mitchell to pay the entire multi-million-dollar balance in full within 24 hours or face immediate aggressive foreclosure. I took the heavy pen in my hand. I thought about the sickening sound of Leo's small back hitting the dining room drywall. I looked at the smug signatures Mitchell had penned years ago. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes, officially sealing his fate. The financial trap was fully armed, and Mitchell was standing directly on the tripwire. I sat at the scratched wooden table in my kitchen with the morning sun casting long shadows across the floorboards. My cell phone vibrated violently against the hard wood. The caller ID showed Naomi's name. I answered the call and immediately heard the ragged, uneven sound of my daughter crying. She did not say hello. She bypassed any normal greeting and went straight into a desperate, frantic plea. She begged me not to contact the authorities or the police about the brutal incident at the dinner party. She pleaded with me to let the physical assault on Leo slide into the past as a simple, unfortunate misunderstanding. My grip on the phone tightened until my calloused knuckles ached. Naomi explained the agonizing situation she was currently trapped in. Logan had cornered her the very second I walked out of his father's house. He had screamed in her face, blaming my silent departure for ruining his family's perfect evening. He threatened to file for an immediate messy divorce if I made any kind of legal or public scene. Logan assured her that his father's high-priced corporate lawyers would ensure she walked away with absolutely nothing. He promised to leave her completely destitute, stripping her of the house, the cars, and any financial support. He had effectively weaponized her own livelihood to force her into terrified silence. Naomi sobbed into the receiver, her voice breaking, as she admitted how terrified she was of losing everything. She told me she could not afford to raise Leo on her own if Logan followed through on his cruel, aggressive threats. She truly believed that enduring the physical and emotional abuse of her in-laws was the only way to keep a solid roof over her son's head. I listened to the sheer panic in my daughter's voice and felt a cold, calculated rage settle deep inside my chest. Logan had systematically broken down her confidence over the years, turning my strong, intelligent girl into a fearful hostage in her own marriage. He was using the grand illusion of his family's immense wealth as a heavy leash to keep her completely submissive. I did not raise my voice or offer empty emotional comfort. I told Naomi that I loved her and that I would handle the situation my way. I ended the call before she could beg me to surrender to their demands. I placed the phone down on the table and stared at the dark screen. The harsh reality of Naomi's situation was crystal clear. She was not just emotionally manipulated by her husband. She was entirely financially dependent on a family of arrogant narcissists. Logan had created a perfect cycle of domestic abuse, isolating her from her own assets and making her firmly believe she needed his father's money just to survive. I knew that simply calling the police to report the physical assault on Leo would not be enough. If I caused the arrest of Mitchell for child abuse, Logan would retaliate by destroying Naomi financially during the ensuing divorce proceedings. I needed to neutralize their financial leverage completely before I dropped the final legal hammer on their heads. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonathan Hayes. He answered immediately, anticipating my next strict command. I gave him a new, highly specific directive. I instructed Jonathan to bypass the standard legal protocols and execute a covert forensic audit on every single financial asset tied to Naomi and Logan. I wanted a complete, ruthless dissection of their joint bank accounts, their investment portfolios, and the hidden trust funds I had secretly established for Naomi years ago under a shell corporation. I demanded to know exactly where every single dollar had originated and where it had gone during the course of their marriage. Jonathan warned me that digging into personal joint accounts required navigating complex legal loopholes and aggressive maneuvers. I cut him off immediately. I told him to use the full weight of my corporate resources and deploy the top financial investigators on our payroll. I gave him exactly 4 hours to pull the banking records and follow the digital paper trail. I refused to let my daughter remain a hostage to a man who possessed no real power of his own. I poured the rest of my coffee down the kitchen sink and washed the mug with freezing cold water. The battle had officially shifted from a physical confrontation to a total financial dismantling. I was going to tear down the walls of their counterfeit empire and show Naomi that her husband was nothing but a fragile, pathetic fraud. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the thick tree line when Jonathan's black sedan pulled back into my gravel driveway. He stepped out of the vehicle carrying a sleek silver briefcase. He did not have his usual calm, collected demeanor. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes reflected a deep professional disgust. Jonathan walked directly into my cabin and snapped the briefcase open on the dining table. He laid out a series of highlighted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and encrypted corporate ledgers. The results of the forensic audit were absolutely sickening. Jonathan pointed to a series of massive unauthorized withdrawals originating from Naomi's supposedly secure private accounts. Over the last 2 years, Logan had been systematically draining the substantial college savings and the hidden trust funds I had set up for my daughter. He had forged her electronic signature on dozens of high-value transfer requests. Logan had not used the money to support his own family or invest in their future. The concrete paper trail proved that every single stolen dollar had been funneled directly into dummy corporations entirely controlled by his father. Mitchell's pristine real estate empire was actually bleeding cash and failing spectacularly behind the scenes. To keep up the grand facade of extreme wealth and high society dominance, Mitchell had forced his own son to embezzle funds from his wife. Logan had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Naomi simply to prop up his father's collapsing business ventures. The expensive mansion, the luxury sports cars, and the elite country club memberships were entirely financed by the money I had earned and gifted to my daughter. They were living like untouchable kings on stolen blue-collar wealth while simultaneously mocking the very hands that fed them. I stared at the damning financial documents tracing the lines of stolen money with my calloused finger. Logan had threatened to leave Naomi completely destitute, purposely hiding the fact that she was the only reason he had a single dime to his name. The sheer audacity of their multi-layered crime solidified my resolve. I instructed Jonathan to package the embezzlement evidence into an ironclad federal fraud dossier. The trap was fully set and primed. I was going to let Logan and Mitchell dig their own graves before I buried them under the heavy weight of their own criminal arrogance. The heavy crunch of tires on my gravel driveway interrupted the quiet morning. I looked out the kitchen window and watched a pristine silver Mercedes sedan come to a halt. Two men stepped out into the crisp air. They wore custom-tailored navy suits and carried expensive leather briefcases. They looked completely out of place against the backdrop of my rustic wooden cabin and the surrounding dense forest. They marched up my porch steps with a synchronized aggressive stride that screamed corporate intimidation. I did not bother to open the door for them. I waited until they pounded heavily on the wood before turning the handle and stepping back. The two lawyers barged into my home without waiting for an invitation. The lead attorney, a tall man with slicked back hair, immediately began reciting legal jargon in a loud, authoritative voice. He threw a thick document onto my scratched dining table. It was a formal cease and desist order drafted by Mitchell's high-priced legal team. The lawyer sneered and informed me that his client demanded my absolute silence regarding the unfortunate misunderstanding at the dinner party. He stated that if I ever spoke a single word to anyone about Mitchell laying his hands on Leo, I would be sued into complete oblivion. He threatened to file catastrophic defamation charges that would instantly drain my pension and force me out of my modest home. The second lawyer stood with his arms crossed, attempting to physically intimidate me with his presence. They painted a vivid, terrifying picture of endless litigation meant to crush a blue-collar worker under mountains of legal fees. They detailed exactly how they would drag my name through the mud, making sure I spent my final years bankrupt and alone. They assumed I was ignorant of how the law worked. They believed their aggressive posturing and expensive suits would force me to cower in fear and sign the non-disclosure agreement attached to the back of the folder. I looked down at the heavy legal document resting on my table. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I let them finish their rehearsed, terrifying speech. I wanted them to completely empty their arsenal of threats before I dismantled their entire case. I turned my back to the aggressive corporate lawyers and walked calmly toward my kitchen counter. I picked up my chipped ceramic mug and slowly poured myself a fresh cup of dark black coffee from the stovetop percolator. The tall lead attorney scoffed, demanding to know if I fully understood the severe legal peril I was currently facing. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter liquid warm my throat. I set the mug down and reached for the sleek black laptop resting on the far end of the counter. I carried the device over to the dining table and placed it directly on top of their threatening cease and desist order. I flipped the screen open and turned it so both men had a perfect, unobstructed view. I did not say a word. I simply pressed the spacebar to initiate the video file. The screen instantly lit up with crystal-clear, high-definition security footage from Mitchell's dining room. The video played the exact moment Leo accidentally knocked over the wine glass. The audio was pristine, capturing the shattering crystal and Mitchell's explosive, violent reaction. The two lawyers watched in stunned silence as the digital version of Mitchell grabbed my grandson by the collar and slammed him brutally against the wall. The sound of the boy hitting the drywall echoed sharply from the small laptop speakers. I pressed the spacebar again, pausing the video on a high-resolution freeze frame of Mitchell's contorted, enraged face. The second lawyer swallowed hard, his previous arrogant posture completely dissolving. He asked in a trembling voice how I had managed to obtain that highly confidential internal footage. I looked at him with cold, absolute authority. I explained that Mitchell's expensive smart home security network was laughably vulnerable. I revealed that I had personally hacked into their encrypted server from my battered cell phone the very second I walked out of his front doors. I downloaded the entire raw surveillance file before Mitchell even realized the dinner party was over. The physical evidence of his unprovoked assault was perfectly preserved and completely undeniable. I informed them that true power does not rely on loud threats or pieces of paper. It relies on leverage, and I currently held the ultimate leverage over their arrogant client. The lead attorney stared at the frozen image on the screen, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He desperately reached for his briefcase, attempting to formulate a new legal strategy to suppress the digital evidence. He stammered out a weak threat about illegal wiretapping and unauthorized digital access. I took another sip of my coffee and completely obliterated his remaining confidence. I informed the sweating lawyers that their legal counterattacks were completely useless because the footage was no longer exclusively in my possession. I told them that a secure encrypted copy of the video had already been delivered directly to the personal email inbox of the local police chief. I explained that the chief was a man of strict principle who could not be bought, intimidated, or buried under corporate paperwork. The raw evidence of child abuse was currently sitting on the desk of the highest law enforcement official in the county. The realization hit the two lawyers like a physical blow to the chest. They instantly understood the catastrophic implications. Mitchell was no longer facing a simple civil dispute over family boundaries. He was facing a severe criminal investigation for aggravated assault on a minor. Any attempt to enforce their cease and desist order would immediately implicate them in a massive criminal cover-up. The attorneys did not say another word. They scrambled to grab their expensive briefcases, their hands shaking violently. They practically shoved each other out of the way as they fled through my front door. They ran down the porch steps and threw themselves into their silver Mercedes. The tires kicked up a massive cloud of dust and gravel as they sped away from my cabin in sheer panic. Miles away in his locked-out corporate headquarters, Mitchell received their frantic, panicked phone call. He listened to his top lawyers abandon his defense and advise him to secure a criminal attorney immediately. The devastating truth finally pierced his thick, arrogant skull. He realized his money and his status could not shield him. He was dealing with a highly dangerous, invisible opponent who was systematically tearing his entire life to the ground. The chilling reality of a prison sentence destroyed his carefully crafted illusion of absolute control. The predator had officially become the prey. The bright afternoon sun filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding my cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden porch. I sat on the top step watching my grandson try to throw a baseball across the yard. Leo had been quiet ever since Naomi bravely defied Logan's orders and dropped the boy off at my house for the weekend. He pulled his arm back to pitch the ball but suddenly winced, dropping his hand to his side. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped his lips. I stood up immediately and walked down the steps. I did not ask him if he was okay. I asked him exactly where it hurt. Leo lifted his shirt slightly and pointed to his lower right rib cage, the exact spot where Mitchell had slammed him into the solid dining room wall. A dark, ugly bruise had blossomed across his pale skin. I did not hesitate or wait for the pain to pass. I lifted Leo, gently placed him in the passenger seat of my truck, and drove straight to the emergency medical clinic in town. The sterile white lights of the clinic waiting room buzzed with a low mechanical hum. I held Leo's uninjured hand, projecting absolute calm, while a lethal protective fury boiled in my veins. The attending physician, a stern woman with sharp, observant eyes, took Leo into the examination room. She gently pressed her fingers along his bruised rib cage. Leo let out a sharp cry of pain, his small body tensing. She immediately halted the physical exam and ordered a full set of digital X-rays. I paced the small linoleum-floored room, my heavy work boots squeaking softly against the tiles. 20 minutes later, the doctor returned holding a large manila envelope. She clipped the translucent film onto the glowing light board and pointed a pen at a faint, jagged line on the lower right side of Leo's rib cage. It was a hairline fracture. The doctor stated clearly that the injury was caused by a blunt, forceful impact. It was not the kind of injury a boy sustains from a simple playground fall. I stared at the jagged line on the illuminated film. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of Mitchell's arrogance and cruelty. The doctor did not leave the room to process the paperwork. She picked up the wall-mounted telephone right there in the examination room and dialed the direct emergency line for Child Protective Services. She cited her legal status as a mandated reporter. She described the exact nature of the hairline fracture and explicitly stated it was the result of suspected domestic child abuse. I sat down next to Leo and placed my hand on his shoulder. I assured my grandson that he was completely safe and that absolutely no one in the Mitchell family was ever going to hurt him again. Within 15 minutes, a uniformed police officer walked through the swinging doors of the emergency clinic. He carried a heavy notepad and possessed a strict, no-nonsense demeanor. He asked the doctor for the initial medical assessment. The doctor handed over the freshly printed medical record signed and stamped with her official credentials. The situation was no longer just a private family dispute or hearsay. It was documented, irrefutable medical evidence of a violent assault against a minor. The officer turned to me and asked for my official statement. I stood up, keeping my posture rigid and commanding. I did not let emotion cloud my words. I gave a cold, precise, and completely factual account of the dinner party. I detailed exactly how Mitchell had grabbed Leo by the collar and slammed him into the drywall. I provided the exact time, the specific location, and the full names of every single person present in the room. I made certain the officer recorded Logan's cowardice in failing to intervene and Patricia's cruel endorsement of the violence. The officer wrote down every single word, his expression hardening as he realized the prominent identity of the accused. I informed the officer that crystal-clear, high-definition security footage of the entire incident was already sitting securely in the personal inbox of the local police chief. The officer's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He closed his notepad with a sharp snap and stated that an active criminal investigation was now officially underway. The medical report was the definitive anchor. The legal trap had closed completely around Mitchell's neck. The automatic glass doors of the emergency clinic slid open with a loud mechanical hiss. Logan stormed into the quiet waiting room, his face flushed red with manic panic and misdirected rage. He gripped a stack of hastily drafted legal documents in his trembling hand. He marched directly toward the examination area, loudly demanding to see his son. A nurse tried to intercept him, but Logan aggressively shoved past her. He spotted me standing outside Leo's room and charged forward. Logan frantically waved the papers in the air. He announced that he had successfully petitioned a friendly judge to grant an emergency ex parte restraining order. He claimed the order legally barred me from coming within 100 feet of Leo. Logan sneered desperately, trying to regain the dominance he had spectacularly lost the day before. He ordered me to leave the hospital immediately or face instant arrest for violating a direct court order. He believed a piece of paper could shield him from the consequences of his complicity. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even look at the useless stack of papers trembling in Logan's hand. Instead, I closed the distance between us, stepping directly into his personal space. I looked down into Logan's terrified, shifting eyes and spoke in a low, dangerous whisper that carried the heavy weight of a death sentence. I informed him that a family court judge had zero jurisdiction over an active, escalating criminal investigation for child abuse. I pointed to the police officer standing just a few feet away, holding the medical file that documented Mitchell's violent crime. I explained that Child Protective Services was already involved and Logan was officially listed as a negligent accomplice to the assault. Logan's arrogant sneer completely evaporated. The color drained from his face as he looked at the uniformed officer and realized the massive, inescapable scale of his miscalculation. I promised Logan that I was going to rip his counterfeit life apart piece by tiny piece. I swore to completely sever his parental rights and legally strip him of every single asset he had stolen from my daughter. The custody war had officially begun, and Logan had brought a flimsy piece of paper to a total financial execution. He stood frozen in the sterile clinic hallway, thoroughly defeated as the crushing reality of his absolute destruction finally set in. Mitchell stood on the pristine 18th green of the Oak Bridge Country Club, gripping a titanium putter with sweaty, trembling hands. The morning sun glared off his white polo shirt, but the heat he felt had absolutely nothing to do with the weather. He was completely cornered. The total financial freeze Jonathan had orchestrated left him completely desperate and gasping for air. He was surrounded by three of the most powerful private investors in the state, men whose combined bank accounts could instantly halt his impending bankruptcy. Mitchell forced a wide, charming smile, attempting to mask the absolute panic rotting his insides. He casually pitched a bridge loan proposal to the men, phrasing it as a temporary cash flow adjustment for a highly lucrative expansion. He desperately needed $2 million just to keep the lights on at his commercial headquarters. The investors leaned on their golf clubs, eyeing him with cold, calculating skepticism. They were sharks, smelling fresh blood in the water. Before the lead investor could demand hard collateral, the heavy wooden doors of the clubhouse swung open with a violent crash. The elite members on the patio turned their heads in sheer shock. Two uniformed police officers marched directly onto the manicured grass. They did not pause to respect the quiet etiquette of the golf course. Their heavy black boots left deep, aggressive indentations on the perfect green turf. They bypassed the club manager, frantically trying to intercept them, and walked straight toward Mitchell's group. Mitchell froze the titanium putter slipping from his sweaty grip and clattering harshly against the ground. The lead officer stopped exactly 2 feet away from Mitchell and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The officer raised his voice, ensuring the sound carried perfectly across the silent patio. and into the ears of every wealthy spectator present. He loudly announced that he held an active non-bailable arrest warrant for Mitchell. The officer stated the charges with brutal clinical precision. Mitchell was officially under arrest for felony child abuse and aggravated assault against a minor. The three wealthy investors instinctively took a massive step backward, physically distancing themselves from the accused. Mitchell's face drained of all color, replacing his arrogant flush with a sickening chalky white. The glamorous facade he had spent decades building shattered instantly under the harsh morning sun. He opened his mouth to vehemently deny the charges, but the officer grabbed his wrist and violently twisted his arm behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed loudly across the silent country club green. The cold steel locked tightly around Mitchell's wrists, pinning his arms awkwardly against his lower back. The lead officer forcefully patted down Mitchell's tailored slacks, completely ignoring his frantic, humiliating pleas to handle the matter privately inside the clubhouse. The wealthy elite, who had once clinked crystal champagne glasses with Mitchell, now stood completely still, watching his absolute degradation with morbid fascination. Mitchell begged the investors not to leave, loudly promising that this was a massive misunderstanding orchestrated by a disgruntled low-class relative. He desperately tried to salvage the $2 million lifeline he needed to survive the day. The investors stared back at him with faces of pure stone, their silence communicating a permanent severing of professional ties. Suddenly, the sharp clacking of high heels shattered the quiet tension. Patricia rushed out of the clubhouse dining room, her silk blouse fluttering as she sprinted across the patio. She pushed past a stunned waiter and marched directly onto the grass, completely losing her aristocratic composure. Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the officers release her husband immediately. She wildly accused the police of harassment and threatened to have their badges revoked by the end of the hour. The officers ignored her, shrieking entirely, and continued reading Mitchell his Miranda rights. Patricia's face twisted into a mask of furious, unhinged entitlement. She operated under the absolute delusion that her family's wealth placed them entirely above the law. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick-banded stack of $100 bills. She had frantically withdrawn the emergency cash earlier that morning, fully aware of the freezing bank accounts. Patricia shoved the stack of money directly into the chest of the arresting officer. She loudly ordered him to take the cash, leave the property, and erase the arrest warrant from the digital system. She sneered, telling the officer that the sum was more than he made in an entire year of miserable civil service. She demanded he take the payoff and learn to respect his betters. Her voice carried the same vicious arrogance she had used when she praised Mitchell for violently throwing my grandson into a wall. She fully expected the officer to quietly pocket the bribe and walk away. The arresting officer did not even glance at the thick stack of $100 bills pressed against his uniform. He knocked the money out of Patricia's hand with a swift, aggressive strike. The banded cash hit the pristine golf green and burst open, scattering perfectly crisp bills across the dewy grass. Patricia gasped in sheer outrage, genuinely shocked that her blatant display of wealth had been so violently rejected. Before she could unleash another furious insult, the second officer moved in with absolute tactical precision. He grabbed Patricia by both shoulders, spun her around roughly, and slammed her face first against the side of a parked golf cart. Patricia shrieked in sudden pain and profound indignation as a second pair of steel handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists. The officer loudly read her Miranda rights, officially placing her under arrest for the direct attempted bribery of a public law enforcement official. He cited the felony charge clearly, making sure the entire crowd of elite spectators heard the exact nature of her immediate crime. Patricia thrashed wildly against the golf cart, crying tears of total humiliation as the cold metal dug into her skin. She looked frantically toward the clubhouse patio, expecting her wealthy peers to intervene and save her from the horrific indignity. Instead, she met a solid wall of absolute disgust. The three private investors who had been considering Mitchell's desperate bridge loan pulled their cell phones from their pockets in perfect unison. They turned their backs on the disgraced couple and immediately dialed their respective financial teams. They ordered an instantaneous permanent withdrawal of all corporate backing, severing every single business tie they held with Mitchell's firm. The news of the arrests and the bribery attempt would spread through the high society network before Mitchell even reached the precinct-holding cell. The social and financial destruction I had meticulously engineered was playing out in spectacular fashion. Mitchell and Patricia were paraded across the country club lawn in handcuffs, walking directly over their own scattered bribe money. They were shoved roughly into the back of a waiting police cruiser, completely stripped of their power, their reputation, and their false superiority. They were finally experiencing the ruthless consequences of crossing a man who understood exactly how to systematically dismantle an empire. The heavy cruiser doors slammed shut, locking them inside a nightmare of their own making. The fluorescent lights of the pharmacy buzzed with a dull, grating hum. Naomi stood at the checkout counter holding a small white paper bag containing Leo's prescribed pain medication. Her hands still trembled slightly from the horrific events at the emergency clinic. She reached into her designer leather purse and pulled out her joint premium credit card. She handed it to the pharmacist with a polite, exhausted smile. The pharmacist swiped the heavy metal card through the machine. The terminal beeped a sharp, aggressive tone. The pharmacist frowned, tapped the screen, and swiped the card a second time. The same harsh beep echoed across the quiet counter. The pharmacist pushed the card back across the laminate surface. He quietly informed Naomi that the transaction had been declined. Naomi felt a sudden rush of heat to her cheeks. She quickly apologized, blaming a simple bank error, and pulled out her personal debit card. She inserted the chip and waited. The machine displayed a stark red message indicating insufficient funds. The pharmacist looked at his monitor and lowered his voice. He told her that the system was showing a completely zeroed-out balance across her connected accounts. A block of pure ice dropped into Naomi's stomach. She knew her personal checking account held the monthly household allowance and her private trust distributions. It was impossible for it to be empty. She grabbed the medication bag, handed the pharmacist a crumpled $50 bill from the bottom of her purse, and practically ran out the automatic sliding doors. She climbed into her luxury SUV and gripped the leather steering wheel. Her mind raced back to the strange, terrifying behavior of her husband over the past 48 hours. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal and sped through the quiet suburban streets toward their sprawling house. She ignored the speed limits, driven by a sudden sickening intuition. Naomi sprinted through the front door and rushed straight into Logan's home office. She powered on the desktop computer and navigated directly to their joint banking portal. She typed in her credentials with shaking fingers. The dashboard loaded, displaying a row of absolute zeros. She clicked frantically on the transaction history. Page after page revealed a methodical, relentless draining of funds. Her college savings account for Leo was entirely gone. Her personal trust fund, the financial safety net her father had quietly built for her, had been systematically wired to a corporate holding account she did not recognize. She hit print. The laser printer hummed to life, spitting out pages of undeniable proof. The facade of her perfect, wealthy marriage collapsed right in front of her eyes. Logan had not just lied to her, he had stolen her entire future. Naomi gripped the stack of freshly printed bank statements in her fist. She marched out of the home office and down the wide, carpeted hallway. She found Logan standing in the center of the massive living room. He was pouring a tall glass of amber liquor from a crystal decanter. His hands were shaking, and his usually perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. The catastrophic financial freeze and his father's impending criminal arrest had completely unhinged him. Naomi walked directly up to him and slammed the stack of papers onto the glass coffee table. She demanded to know exactly where her money had gone. She pointed to the massive, unauthorized wire transfers draining Leo's college fund and her private trust. Logan stared at the papers, but he did not show a single ounce of remorse. The cornered coward instantly went on the attack. He slammed his crystal glass down next to the papers, spilling the expensive liquor across the glass surface. He screamed that he was the man of the house, and he had every legal right to move their assets wherever he deemed necessary. He blamed Naomi for the entire crisis. He yelled that her ungrateful blue-collar father had orchestrated the financial ruin currently suffocating his family. Logan stepped aggressively into Naomi's personal space, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. He told her she was a worthless burden who brought absolutely nothing of value to his elite lifestyle. He shouted that without his family's prestigious name, she was just another piece of suburban trash. Naomi did not back down. She looked him dead in the eye and called him a pathetic thief. Logan completely snapped. He drew his hand back and struck Naomi across the face with a brutal, open-handed slap. The sheer force of the physical blow knocked her backward. She collided with the edge of the leather sofa and stumbled to the floor. Her cheek instantly burned with intense, stinging heat. Logan stood over her, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with misplaced, cowardly rage. He pointed a shaking finger toward the front door. He ordered her to pack her bags and get off his property immediately. He demanded she leave the house completely empty-handed, confidently threatening to unleash his father's lawyers to ensure she never saw her son or her money ever again. Naomi sat on the hardwood floor of the living room. The sharp, stinging sensation radiating across her face did not bring tears. It brought absolute terrifying clarity. The violent strike instantly shattered the heavy illusion she had lived under for nearly a decade. The sophisticated, wealthy man she thought she had married died the very second his hand made contact with her skin. He was just an abusive, desperate fraud wearing an expensive suit. Naomi did not argue. She did not scream or throw objects or beg for an explanation. She simply stood up, smoothing the fabric of her shirt. She looked at Logan one final time, completely erasing him from her heart, and turned her back on him. She walked away in total silence, leaving him shouting empty, pathetic threats into the void of the living room. She climbed the grand staircase with swift, purposeful steps. Naomi bypassed her master bedroom entirely and went straight to Leo's room. She gently shook her 9-year-old son awake. She did not panic him. She kept her voice steady and reassuring, telling him they were going to visit his grandfather for a few days. She grabbed a single duffel bag from the closet and stuffed it with Leo's clothes, his essential medications, and his favorite books. She slung the strap over her shoulder, took Leo by the hand, and led him down the back staircase toward the attached garage. She bypassed Logan screaming completely. Naomi unlocked her luxury SUV, strapped Leo securely into the back seat, and climbed behind the steering wheel. She hit the garage door opener and threw the vehicle into reverse. The tires squealed briefly against the polished concrete as she backed out into the dark, quiet street. She shifted into drive and accelerated away from the sprawling mansion, never once looking in the rearview mirror. She navigated the winding suburban roads, heading directly toward the heavy tree line on the outskirts of town. She drove for miles in the dead of night, her grip on the steering wheel firm and unwavering. She pulled onto the rough gravel driveway of Gerald's modest wooden cabin. The porch light was already on, cutting a bright, welcoming path through the darkness. My daughter stepped out of her vehicle, holding her son's hand. She walked up the wooden steps and finally chose her father's uncompromising protection over her abuser's golden cage. The morning sun breached the heavy silk curtains of the master bedroom. Logan stirred in the massive king-sized bed, his arm reaching out across the mattress. He found only cold, empty sheets. He sat up, rubbing his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes from the liquor he had consumed the night before. He expected to hear the usual sounds of Naomi preparing breakfast or Leo playing in the hallway. The mansion was completely silent. He threw off the heavy duvet and marched down the grand staircase, his anger rekindling. He intended to scream at Naomi for insubordination, fully believing she was cowering somewhere in the house. His bare feet hit the cold marble of the foyer, just as a heavy, authoritative pounding echoed against the thick mahogany front door. Logan sneered, assuming it was a delivery driver or an annoying neighbor. He ripped the door open, ready to unleash his foul temper. His voice caught in his throat. A massive, bright red foreclosure notice was plastered directly onto the polished wood. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stood on his pristine front lawn. They did not look friendly or deferential to his wealthy status. They wore tactical vests and carried thick clipboards loaded with legal documents. The lead deputy stepped onto the porch and stated his name and badge number. He informed Logan that the entire estate, including the house, the vehicles in the garage, and all physical assets within the property lines, was officially under immediate government seizure. Logan stared at the red paper, his brain struggling to comprehend the absolute absurdity of the situation. He demanded they remove the garbage from his door, arrogantly citing his father's immense legal power. He threatened to have both deputies fired and stripped of their pensions before noon. The second deputy unclipped his radio, utterly unfazed by the wealthy man's temper tantrum. He stepped forward and shoved a thick manila folder directly into Logan's chest. He ordered Logan to read the federal court seal stamped on the front page. The document authorized the immediate liquidation of the property connected to Mitchell's fraudulent shell corporations. Logan looked down at the undeniable legal seal, the color rapidly draining from his face. The illusion of his untouchable elite status cracked under the heavy boots of the law enforcement officers standing on his manicured grass. Logan shoved the manila folder back at the deputy and frantically dug into the pocket of his sweatpants. He pulled out his sleek cell phone, his hands shaking with a mix of fury and sudden creeping terror. He loudly declared that this was a catastrophic clerical error. He promised the deputies that his father was going to personally destroy their careers. He dialed Mitchell's private unlisted cell phone number, expecting the immediate reassuring bark of the powerful corporate titan. He pressed the phone hard against his ear. A harsh, robotic voice filled the line. The automated recording stated that the number he dialed was permanently disconnected and no longer in service. Logan pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the screen in pure shock. He hit redial. The exact same robotic voice repeated the mechanical, lifeless message. His father, the man who controlled every aspect of their wealthy existence, had vanished from the network. Logan's breathing grew shallow. He swiped rapidly across his phone screen and opened his elite banking application. He possessed platinum accounts that normally displayed figures in the hundreds of thousands. The loading screen spun for a fraction of a second before displaying his financial reality. Every single account connected to his name was completely decimated. The checking account showed a negative balance. The joint savings account he shared with Naomi was zeroed out. The emergency corporate reserve fund displayed a glaring red error code indicating a federal freeze. Gerald's forensic audit had worked with absolute ruthless precision. The top-tier financial investigators had tracked every stolen dollar, flagged every fraudulent transfer, and neutralized Logan's entire livelihood in a matter of hours. The money he had embezzled from his wife to prop up his father's failing empire was gone, legally seized as evidence of massive corporate fraud. Logan stood barefoot on his luxurious marble entryway, holding a useless piece of metal. He had threatened to leave Naomi destitute and penniless the day before. Now he was staring at his own complete financial annihilation. He had absolutely nothing left. No father to protect him, no money to hire a lawyer, no leverage to maintain his hollow, arrogant power. The trap had closed with a deafening finality, severing his access to the outside world. The lead deputy tapped his heavy flashlight against the doorframe, shattering Logan's paralyzed state. He gave Logan exactly 5 minutes to step off the property. He stated clearly that any attempt to remove physical items, electronics, or valuables from the house would result in an immediate arrest for theft of seized federal assets. Logan's eyes darted wildly around the grand foyer. He turned and sprinted toward the attached garage, desperately hitting the button to raise the heavy doors. He intended to take his luxury sports car and flee the humiliating scene. The doors rolled up to reveal a heavy tow truck already hitched to the rear axle of his vehicle. A third officer stood by the bumper signing a yellow impound manifest. Logan screamed, lunging toward the driver's side door. The two deputies caught him instantly. They grabbed his arms, twisting him backward with swift, unapologetic force. They marched him out of the garage, down the long paved driveway, and shoved him past the heavy iron gates of the estate. They warned him that stepping foot back onto the concrete would result in a trespassing charge and an immediate trip to the county jail. The heavy iron gates swung shut with a loud metallic clank, automatically locking from the inside. Logan stood on the rough asphalt of the suburban street. He was wearing nothing but a wrinkled t-shirt and gray sweatpants. He had no wallet, no keys, and no assets. The crushing weight of his absolute ruin pressed down on his chest. His mind frantically searched for a target to absorb his massive, violent failure. He knew his father was unreachable in federal custody. He knew the police were legally untouchable. That left only one person responsible for tearing down his counterfeit empire, Gerald. Logan's initial panic morphed into a dark, blinding rage. He clenched his fists until his fingernails dug deeply into his palms. He did not call for a cab or walk toward town to seek help. He turned his body toward the dense tree line that bordered the wealthy subdivision. He began to walk down the shoulder of the road, his bare feet hitting the hard asphalt. He was going to march miles through the early morning chill straight to the rustic cabin in the woods. He intended to exact a brutal physical revenge against the man who had completely destroyed his life. The sun was fully up by the time Logan dragged his bleeding feet up the long dirt road leading to my property. The sharp gravel and broken twigs had torn the soles of his bare feet to shreds during his miles-long, frantic march from the gated community. He did not care about the pain. His mind was completely consumed by a toxic, blinding rage. He reached the heavy wooden gate at the perimeter of my cabin and began to kick it violently with his bruised heels. He screamed Naomi's name, his voice echoing through the dense morning forest. The sound was not a plea for his wife to return. It was a vicious, entitled demand from a man who still believed he owned her. He rattled the heavy iron latch, shouting that he knew she was hiding inside. He ordered her to come out and fix the massive financial disaster she and her father had caused. He cursed my name, blaming my interference for the sudden catastrophic destruction of his perfect life. He promised to break down the door if she did not immediately surrender to his authority. I sat quietly in the dark kitchen, listening to his unhinged roaring. I instructed Naomi to stay securely in the back room with Leo and keep the door locked. I did not want my daughter or my grandson to witness the final, pathetic collapse of their abuser. I picked up a heavy wooden clipboard resting on the kitchen island. I adjusted my jacket, walked calmly through the living room, and opened the front door. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped out onto the wooden porch. I stood at the top of the steps, looking down at the ragged, barefoot man kicking my gate. Logan stopped screaming the second he saw me. His chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths, and his eyes locked onto mine with pure, unadulterated hatred. He demanded that I open the gate and hand over his family. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge his frantic commands. I simply unlatched the gate and let it swing open, granting him full access to the yard. He took a hesitant step forward, unsure of my absolute calm. I stood completely still, gripping the clipboard in my right hand, waiting for him to cross the threshold into my domain. Logan marched into the front yard, his torn gray sweatpants covered in dust and morning dew. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest, threatening to call the authorities and press kidnapping charges if I did not produce his wife and son immediately. He was completely detached from reality, desperately clinging to the illusion of his former power. I did not entertain his delusional threats. I simply raised my right arm and tossed the heavy wooden clipboard directly at his bruised feet. It landed in the dirt with a dull thud. I told Logan to look at the paperwork attached to the front. I explained that those documents were the final nails in his counterfeit coffin. I informed him that the top pages contained an expedited petition for full divorce and absolute sole custody of Leo. Naomi had signed the papers in my kitchen an hour before the sun came up, permanently severing her legal ties to his abusive family. I watched Logan stare down at the stark legal print, his arrogant jaw trembling. I did not stop there. I instructed him to look at the second half of the stack. I revealed that my corporate lawyers had officially filed a massive civil lawsuit against him personally. We were demanding immediate total financial restitution for every single dollar he had embezzled from Naomi's trust fund and Leo's college savings. I told him the court had already frozen his assets to ensure my daughter was fully repaid from whatever liquidated scraps remained of his father's seized estate. Logan's mind completely snapped under the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. The final realization that he was entirely powerless, penniless, and abandoned destroyed his remaining sanity. He let out a primal, guttural scream of pure rage. He spun around, his frantic eyes scanning my yard for a weapon. He spotted a heavy, rusted metal pipe resting near a stack of firewood. He lunged into the dirt and wrapped his bloody hands around the cold steel. Logan hoisted the heavy pipe over his shoulder and charged directly at my porch. He shrieked that he was going to cave my skull in and drag his family out of my house by force. He closed the distance in seconds, his bare feet slapping against the gravel as he prepared to swing the lethal weapon at my head. I did not flinch or take a single step backward as Logan charged up the wooden stairs. I stood my ground, my hands resting casually at my sides, watching the desperate man rush toward his own absolute destruction. He raised the rusted metal pipe high into the air, his face twisted into a mask of pure homicidal fury. Before he could swing the heavy steel, the deafening shriek of police sirens shattered the quiet morning forest. The blinding flash of red and blue emergency lights flooded the driveway. I had anticipated Logan's violent retaliation the exact moment I instructed Jonathan to freeze his bank accounts. Jonathan had discreetly installed high-grade motion sensor cameras around the perimeter of my cabin the previous afternoon. The highly advanced security system was linked directly to the county police dispatch via an emergency priority channel. The second Logan began violently kicking my front gate. The automated alert had dispatched a heavily armed patrol unit to my exact location. Logan froze mid-stride on the second step of the porch, the heavy metal pipe trembling in his raised hands. He turned his head just as two county sheriff cruisers skidded to a violent halt in the gravel yard. 4 uniformed officers threw their doors open and sprinted toward the porch with their weapons drawn. They ordered Logan to drop the pipe and get on the ground. Logan stood paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming show of force. He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. 2 officers charged up the steps and tackled him brutally against the hard wooden boards. The heavy metal pipe clattered uselessly into the dirt below. The officers pinned Logan's arms behind his back, pressing his face roughly into the raw timber of my porch. The sharp click of steel handcuffs finalized his total defeat. The lead officer loudly announced the charges, placing Logan under immediate arrest for trespassing and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. I stood over the gasping, restrained man, watching the police drag him to his feet. He was covered in dirt, completely stripped of his arrogant wealth and heading straight to a concrete holding cell. I looked directly into his defeated, terrified eyes and watched the patrol car doors slam shut, permanently locking the abuser away from my family. Patricia sat rigidly in the back seat of a standard, unpleasant rideshare, her posture stiff with absolute indignation. The humiliating process of securing bail for Mitchell had taken every ounce of leverage she possessed. Her elite friends had stopped answering her frantic calls the exact moment the bribery scandal hit the country club gossip network. She had been forced to rely on a high-interest predatory bail bondsman draining the last hidden cash reserves of an obscure offshore account just to walk out of the county jail. She had hired an Uber to drive her directly to my cabin, instructing her personal assistant to follow closely behind and park her prized Mercedes SUV at the curb so she could drive herself home in total triumph. The driver brought the vehicle to a halt in front of my rustic wooden gate. Patricia shoved a crumpled $50 bill at the driver and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. She aggressively smoothed the wrinkles from her tailored cashmere coat, desperately trying to project an aura of untouchable superiority despite the chaotic, disastrous morning. She marched up the gravel driveway with loud, authoritative steps, her sharp heels crunching loudly against the loose stones. She fully expected to find a defeated household, a family trembling in the terrifying aftermath of Logan's violent arrest. Instead, the property was exceptionally quiet. The dense pine trees absorbed the sound of her aggressive approach. Patricia reached the base of the wooden porch and stopped abruptly. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to unleash her final devastating financial maneuver. She intended to simply purchase her family's freedom and completely crush the blue-collar workers standing in her way. She loudly cleared her throat, demanding immediate attention from the master of the house, fully ready to assert her ultimate dominance over a man she considered entirely beneath her social class. She refused to believe that her immense wealth could not solve this temporary inconvenience. I stepped around the side of the cabin, holding a heavy rubber garden hose. The warm afternoon sun beat down on the freshly tilled soil of my vegetable patch. I turned the brass spigot, sending a steady arching spray of water over the bright green leaves. I did not look up or acknowledge her presence when Patricia marched into my yard. I let the heavy silence stretch, forcing her to stand awkwardly in the dirt while I meticulously tended to my garden. The deliberate lack of attention infuriated her beyond measure. She snapped her expensive leather purse open and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock paper check. She held it out like a loaded weapon, her voice cutting sharply through the peaceful sound of the running water. Patricia announced that the check was written for exactly $100,000. She commanded me to accept the massive payment drop, all pending criminal charges against her husband, and force Naomi to permanently withdraw the divorce proceedings. She arrogantly assumed the sheer size of the number would instantly shatter my resolve and buy my complete submission. She promised that if I took the money and silenced my daughter, her family would walk away and leave us in peace forever. I did not reach for the check. I did not even glance at the zeros written boldly across the paper line. I continued moving the hose in a slow, methodical rhythm, soaking the dry earth without a single care in the world. I calmly informed Patricia that her piece of paper was entirely worthless. I told her that a massive, comprehensive forensic audit had already thoroughly dismantled Mitchell's fraudulent empire. Her husband's shell corporations were completely empty, and the bank accounts tied to her name were federally frozen due to the active criminal investigation. The check she was aggressively waving in the air would bounce the absolute second it hit a teller's desk. Patricia's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. She shrieked that I was a pathetic, ignorant old man who completely failed to understand how high society wealth functioned. She swore that her family's sprawling mansion and physical assets alone were worth 10 times the requested bail amounts. I stopped watering the tomatoes and finally turned to look her dead in the eye. I lowered the hose and delivered the exact financial reality she refused to accept. I explained that Mitchell had secretly taken out a massive, high-risk secondary mortgage on their estate to cover his failing corporate investments. I coldly revealed that my private trust, acting through a subsidiary holding company, had quietly purchased that exact debt portfolio hours ago. I now legally owned the primary lien on her beloved mansion. Patricia let out a sharp, hysterical bark of laughter. The sound was brittle, panicked, and completely devoid of genuine humor. She clutched her cashmere coat tightly around her waist, shaking her head in theatrical disbelief. She accused me of fabricating wild, impossible lies to inflate my own fragile ego. She loudly declared that her elite multi-million-dollar estate was absolutely untouchable by a lowly, dirt-covered mechanic living in a rusted wooden shack. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my chest, promising to return with a legion of ruthless corporate attorneys who would legally bury me alive for daring to challenge her supremacy. She demanded I stop playing pathetic mind games and immediately acknowledge her absolute unyielding authority. I did not waste my breath arguing with a woman drowning in her own extreme delusions. I simply tilted my head toward the long stretch of paved road bordering the edge of my property. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of a massive diesel engine echoed through the quiet forest. A large industrial-grade tow truck rounded the bend and pulled aggressively up to the curb, stopping exactly where her assistant had parked her vehicle moments prior. Patricia turned her head, her arrogant smile freezing instantly on her face. The repo men stepped out of the truck cab holding an active seizure warrant on a heavy clipboard. They did not hesitate or ask for permission. They moved with swift mechanical efficiency, securing thick towing chains to the front axle of Patricia's prized Mercedes SUV right in front of her eyes. The heavy yellow lights on the roof flashed brightly, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare across her pale, horrified face. She watched in sheer, paralyzed disbelief as the hydraulic lift hoisted the front wheels of her ultimate symbol of high society status off the asphalt. The driver locked the winch securely into place, completely ignoring Patricia's frantic, high-pitched screams to unhook her personal property. The realization that she was completely bankrupt, devoid of transportation, and entirely defeated finally shattered her mind. She stood rooted in the gravel, her hands covering her mouth as the tow truck accelerated down the road, hauling her luxury vehicle away like cheap scrap metal. I reached down and twisted the brass spigot, cutting off the flow of the garden hose. The water sputtered and died, leaving the yard in absolute silence. I did not offer her a ride, a phone, or a single ounce of sympathy. I turned my back on the shrieking woman, walked up the wooden steps of my porch, and closed the heavy front door, leaving Patricia completely stranded and humiliated in the unforgiving dirt. I watched from the kitchen window as the heavy tow truck disappeared down the winding forest road, hauling Patricia's luxury vehicle away into the fading afternoon light. The dust had barely settled on the gravel driveway when a sleek black sedan pulled up to the exact spot where she had been standing. Jonathan stepped out of the vehicle carrying a thick, locked leather briefcase. He did not possess his usual calm, composed demeanor. His jaw was clenched tight and his eyes reflected a deep, unsettling urgency. He walked swiftly up the porch steps and entered the cabin without knocking. He bypassed the living room and headed straight for the heavy oak dining table. Jonathan unlatched the briefcase with a sharp metallic snap and began pulling out stacks of highly classified financial documents. These were the final, unfiltered results of the deep forensic audit I had ordered hours ago. He laid out bank transfer logs, tax filings, and corporate manifests across the wood. I stood beside him looking down at the mountains of paperwork. Jonathan pointed a steady finger at the central ledger of Mitchell's acclaimed real estate development firm. He stated clearly that he had deployed a team to physically verify the assets listed in the corporate portfolio. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered a completely staggering revelation. Mitchell's multi-million-dollar real estate company had absolutely zero physical assets. They had never poured a single concrete foundation. They had never secured a single construction permit. They had never built a single property. The entire corporate empire was a massive, elaborately constructed Ponzi scheme. Mitchell had spent decades soliciting millions of dollars from wealthy private investors to fund non-existent luxury developments. He used the incoming cash from new investors to pay fake dividends to the older clients, continuously shifting the money to maintain the grand illusion of a highly profitable enterprise. The country club memberships, the sprawling mansion, the imported cars, every single piece of their extravagant lifestyle was completely funded by stolen investor capital. Mitchell had built a house of cards resting entirely on a foundation of massive federal fraud. The sudden freeze on their accounts had completely halted the flow of stolen cash, causing the entire fraudulent structure to collapse inward. I stared at the damning ledgers, tracing the extensive web of counterfeit transactions with my calloused finger. The sheer magnitude of the financial deception was staggering, but Jonathan quickly shifted my attention to a secondary stack of encrypted corporate filings. He warned me that the most sinister aspect of the investigation had nothing to do with the stolen investor capital. He slid a series of incorporation documents across the table. They were the legally binding contracts establishing the offshore holding accounts and dummy corporations used to hide the embezzled funds. I leaned over the table to examine the signature lines at the bottom of the pages. the name officially listed as the sole legal director and primary beneficiary of every single fraudulent account was not Mitchell, it was Logan. Jonathan explained the terrifying reality of the corporate structure. Mitchell had meticulously forged his own son's digital and physical signatures on dozens of high-level financial documents. He had deliberately constructed the entire illegal network to completely insulate himself from criminal liability. Mitchell had knowingly and willingly set up his own child to take the absolute fall for decades of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. If the authorities ever breached the corporate firewall, the legal paper trail would bypass Mitchell entirely and lead federal prosecutors straight to Logan. My son-in-law had strutted around for years loudly bragging about his elite status and his prominent place within his father's prestigious company. He had treated my daughter like a disposable servant, firmly believing he held the keys to a vast, untouchable kingdom. In reality, he was nothing more than a sacrificial lamb bred for the slaughter. Mitchell possessed zero loyalty to anyone, completely willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to protect his fragile ego and stolen wealth. Logan had blindly worshipped a man who had actively built a federal prison cell with his name on it. The physical abuse Logan had enabled and the financial terrorism he had inflicted upon Naomi were born from an absolute delusion of power. He was an empty, pathetic pawn entirely manipulated by a ruthless narcissist. I felt a cold, calculating satisfaction settle deep within my chest. Logan had spent the morning violently screaming outside my gate, blaming me for his total ruin. He had absolutely no idea that his own father had dug his grave years ago. The absolute finality of the situation demanded immediate and ruthless action. The local police department was already holding Mitchell on severe charges of felony child abuse and aggravated assault. Logan was currently sitting in a Concrete County holding cell for armed trespassing and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. Patricia had been dragged away in handcuffs for the blatant bribery of a public official. The entire family had been systematically neutralized on a domestic level. However, the staggering evidence of a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme required a completely different echelon of law enforcement. I did not hesitate or second-guess the catastrophic blow I was about to deliver. I gathered the bank statements, the forged incorporation documents, and the irrefutable proof of the offshore holding accounts. I aligned the heavy stack of paper perfectly and slid it into a thick, tamper-proof security envelope. I pulled the adhesive strip and sealed the package with absolute, unforgiving finality. I handed the heavy envelope directly to Jonathan. I gave him a strict, uncompromising directive. I instructed him to completely bypass the local county prosecutors and the state authorities. This level of systemic corporate fraud and financial terrorism belonged in a higher jurisdiction. I ordered Jonathan to drive straight to the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. He was to hand-deliver the forensic audit directly to the lead agent of the white-collar crime division. I wanted the full crushing weight of the federal government brought down upon Mitchell's counterfeit empire. Submitting these documents meant triggering an unstoppable cascade of federal indictments, asset seizures, and decades-long prison sentences in maximum security federal penitentiaries. The FBI would systematically freeze every remaining dime, confiscate every hidden asset, and legally dismantle whatever fragments of the family's legacy still existed. Jonathan nodded sharply, completely understanding the gravity of the command. He secured the sealed envelope inside his reinforced briefcase and locked the latches. He turned without another word, walking briskly out the front door and descending the porch steps. I stood in the doorway, watching his black sedan accelerate down the gravel driveway and disappear into the dense tree line. The battle had officially escalated far beyond a simple domestic dispute or a local custody war. I had just initiated a total federal annihilation. The Mitchell family was about to face the absolute terrifying wrath of the United States government. The rented boardroom smelled of stale carpet cleaner and cheap coffee. Mitchell paced the length of the room, his usually perfectly coiffed hair disheveled and his expensive silk tie pulled loose. He had been forced to rent this anonymous downtown office space under a fake corporate alias because federal agents were currently tearing his primary headquarters apart. 3 older men sat around the laminate conference table. They were the final remnants of his elite investor pool men who still believed in the invincible facade he had projected for decades. Mitchell stopped pacing and leaned his heavy hands against the edge of the table. He deployed every ounce of his legendary charisma, masking his absolute terror with a forced, confident smile. He spun a complex, desperate lie about a temporary liquidity crisis caused by a rogue banking glitch and an aggressive malicious audit from a rival firm. He insisted the underlying assets were perfectly secure. He just needed a short-term bridge loan, a temporary injection of $10 million to weather the storm, and finalize a massive European development deal that would triple their returns. The three investors exchanged wary glances. They had heard the devastating rumors circulating through the country club that morning. They knew about Patricia's humiliating arrest and the sudden disappearance of Logan. Mitchell raised his voice, his tone shifting from persuasive to aggressively demanding. He reminded them of the immense wealth he had generated for their portfolios over the years. He slammed his fist against the table, demanding their loyalty in his darkest hour. He promised them exclusive equity in his next venture, selling them the exact same fraudulent dream he had used to build his hollow empire. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He knew the FBI was closing in. He needed this cash immediately to charter a private flight out of the country. If these three men walked out the door, his life was officially over. He stared at them, his eyes wide and bloodshot, practically begging for the lifeline. The lead investor sighed, adjusting his glasses, and slowly reached for his gold fountain pen. He stated that they were willing to authorize the emergency transfer, but they required absolute transparent proof of the offshore collateral before signing a single legal document. Mitchell smiled, tasting victory, completely unaware that his ultimate downfall was currently walking down the hallway. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent crash, striking the drywall and shattering the tense atmosphere. Mitchell spun around, his forced smile instantly dropping from his face. He prepared to scream at the intruder for interrupting his critical negotiation. The words died in his throat. I walked slowly into the center of the room. I was no longer wearing the faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and scuffed work boots that defined my quiet life in the woods. I wore a sharp, dark, custom-tailored suit woven from the finest Italian wool. A silk tie rested perfectly against my crisp white collar. My silver hair was neatly combed, and my posture radiated absolute, uncompromising authority. I did not look like a blue-collar mechanic or a vulnerable, aging grandfather. I looked like the apex predator of the corporate financial world. Mitchell froze in place, his eyes darting frantically over my immaculate appearance. His brain struggled to reconcile the image of the dirt-covered man he had mocked for years with the towering corporate titan standing before him. He gripped the edge of the laminate table, his knuckles turning white as the blood drained entirely from his face. He demanded to know how I had bypassed the building security and what I was doing crashing a closed-door executive meeting. I ignored his panicked questions completely. I walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the head of the conference table, invading his physical space. The three investors stared at me in total silence, instantly recognizing the shift in power. They sensed the undeniable weight of my presence and instinctively leaned back in their leather chairs, abandoning Mitchell to face his reckoning alone. Mitchell's breathing turned ragged. He pointed a shaking finger at the door, ordering me to leave before he called the police. I stared directly into his terrified eyes, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room became absolutely suffocating. I told him that calling the police was entirely unnecessary because the federal authorities were already on their way. I watched his bravado crumble into pure, unfiltered panic. The man who had terrorized my daughter, enabled my grandson's abuse, and built an empire on lies was finally cornered. There was nowhere left to run. He was trapped in the room with the architect of his total destruction. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a single crisp document printed on heavy stock paper. I dropped it onto the center of the conference table. The sharp slap of the paper hitting the laminate echoed like a gunshot. Mitchell stared down at the document, refusing to touch it. I informed the room that I was the founder and chairman of Vanguard Apex Holdings. The three investors gasped instantly, recognizing the name of the colossal, invisible entity that controlled vast sectors of the global market. I looked directly at Mitchell and delivered the fatal blow. I explained that Vanguard Apex Holdings had quietly purchased 70% of his fraudulent company's outstanding shares through a series of untraceable shell acquisitions. I was not just his son's father-in-law. I was his primary shareholder, his majority owner, and his absolute master. Mitchell staggered backward, bumping into the wall as his legs gave out. The color completely vanished from his face. He began to stammer, begging for a chance to explain the missing funds, promising he could generate massive returns if I just gave him one more month. I cut him off with a sharp, unforgiving command. I announced that as the majority shareholder, I was executing an immediate hostile takeover. I officially and legally liquidated his entire firm on the spot. Every bank account, every contract, and every remaining asset was now frozen and transferred into receivership under my direct control. The three investors immediately stood up, packed their briefcases, and walked out of the room without saying a single word to the ruined man. Mitchell fell to his knees, openly sobbing, his manicured hands clutching the edge of the table. He begged me for mercy, pleading for a severance package, a loan, or a chance to escape before the FBI arrived. I looked down at him with absolute cold disdain. I felt zero pity for the monster who had gleefully destroyed countless lives. Two towering private security contractors stepped into the boardroom, moving with silent efficiency. I ordered them to remove the trespasser from my property. The guards grabbed Mitchell by the arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. He thrashed and wailed, his expensive suit tearing as they dragged him out the doors, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of his deceit. The private security contractors shoved Mitchell into the polished steel elevator car and hit the lobby button. The heavy doors slid shut, cutting him off from the corporate empire he had spent decades building on a foundation of lies. Mitchell leaned heavily against the mirrored back wall. He gasped for air, his chest heaving under his torn designer suit. Profuse sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes and soaking his crisp collar. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, desperately trying to construct a new lie, a new manipulation to spin his way out of the impending disaster. He convinced himself he could still salvage his reputation if he just reached his private offshore accounts before the authorities caught wind of the liquidation. The elevator descended with a smooth, sickening speed, mirroring his rapid fall from absolute power. The digital floor indicator flashed downward, ticking closer to the ground floor. Mitchell straightened his posture, forcefully adjusting his ruined silk tie. He took a deep breath, preparing to march out of the building with his signature arrogant stride. The soft chime rang out. The steel doors parted. Mitchell stepped forward. He did not find the empty, quiet lobby he expected. A chaotic sea of tactical windbreakers bearing massive yellow federal letters flooded his vision. Over 24 armed FBI agents swarmed the marble expanse. The lead agent stepped directly into Mitchell's path, blocking his exit with absolute authority. He did not offer a polite greeting or a respectful inquiry. He grabbed Mitchell by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed him against the cold, polished stone of the reception desk. Mitchell shrieked, demanding they release him, screaming about his elite connections and his untouchable status. The agents ignored his frantic, pathetic protests. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs locked securely around his wrists, biting painfully into his skin. The lead agent loudly recited a devastating list of charges right in front of the horrified building staff. He formally arrested Mitchell for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated embezzlement, money laundering, and operating a massive interstate Ponzi scheme. Mitchell's knees buckled under the crushing weight of the federal indictments. The agents did not let him fall. They hauled him up by his bound arms and dragged him forcefully through the revolving glass doors, parading him out into the glaring sunlight as a completely broken, ruined man. Miles away, deep within the exclusive confines of the gated suburban enclave, the absolute destruction of the family's counterfeit legacy continued with ruthless precision. Patricia had just managed to secure a humiliating, overpriced cab ride back to her sprawling estate after being abandoned in the dirt at my property. She had locked the heavy mahogany front doors, poured herself a massive glass of expensive red wine, and stripped off her dust-covered cashmere coat. She changed into a pair of immaculate emerald green silk pajamas, desperately trying to self-soothe and convince herself that her husband's money would eventually fix the cascading disaster. She took a long, trembling sip of the dark wine, pacing the length of the grand foyer. She completely ignored the flashing red and blue lights, silently pulling up to the edge of her manicured lawn. Without a single warning, a heavy tactical battering ram smashed violently against the reinforced wood of the front entrance. The massive doors splintered inward, the heavy locks completely shattering under the sheer kinetic force of the breach. The wood fragments scattered across the pristine marble floor. A specialized tactical unit of federal agents flooded the massive foyer, their heavy combat boots tracking dirt across the expensive imported rugs. They shouted clear, deafening commands, securing every exit and locking down the entire perimeter of the estate. Patricia dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered into 100 pieces, the dark red liquid pooling like blood on the polished stone. She shrieked in absolute terror, demanding to know the meaning of the violent intrusion. She arrogantly attempted to assert her dominance, screaming that she owned the property and threatening to sue every single officer in the room for trespassing. The federal agents did not hesitate. Two heavily armed officers grabbed her by the arms, entirely unfazed by her manicured fury. They dragged her roughly across the ruined foyer, ignoring her frantic kicks and high-pitched demands for her private attorney. They marched her straight out the shattered front doorway and hauled her down the wide concrete steps. Patricia thrashed wildly, her expensive silk pajamas slipping and tearing as the agents forced her onto the damp, manicured grass of the front lawn. The cold, unyielding reality of federal law enforcement completely crushed her final illusion of elite immunity. The violent commotion of the federal raid acted like a magnet for the extremely wealthy, status-obsessed residents of the subdivision. The same elite neighbors who had routinely attended Patricia's lavish dinner parties and openly mocked my faded flannel shirts now stood at the edges of their immaculate driveways. They did not rush forward to offer assistance or provide comfort to their disgraced friend. They stood at a safe distance, their eyes wide with morbid fascination, eagerly watching the catastrophic downfall of the neighborhood's most arrogant family. Whispers swept through the growing crowd as they pointed at Patricia, who sat handcuffed in the dirt wearing wrinkled sleepwear, her carefully crafted high society image permanently destroyed. The piercing wail of approaching sirens heralded the arrival of the local media. Aggressive news vans screeched to a halt along the curb, their heavy tires digging into the perfectly trimmed grass. Camera crews leaped from the vehicles, hoisting heavy broadcasting equipment onto their shoulders. Bright, blinding halogen lights illuminated the chaotic scene, casting harsh shadows across the federal agents actively hauling boxes of seized financial documents out of the mansion's front doors. The ultimate consequence of Mitchell's unchecked greed played out live on regional television. Investigative reporters stood directly in front of the shattered mahogany entrance, speaking into their microphones with rapid, severe urgency. They detailed the massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, exposing the fake offshore accounts and the fraudulent corporate ledgers to millions of viewers. They broadcasted the brutal reality that the family's sprawling estate, their luxury cars, and their lavish lifestyle had been entirely funded by stolen investor capital. Patricia turned her face away from the glaring camera lenses, desperately trying to hide her tear-stained, humiliated expression from the national broadcast. The devastating footage of her sitting in the grass in handcuffs secured her permanent social execution. The counterfeit empire was completely dismantled, stripped down to its rotting foundation, and exposed to the unforgiving light of public justice. I sat quietly in my dark cabin, miles away from the suburban chaos, watching the live news feed on a small monitor. The silent adjustment was finalized. The stolen wealth had been seized, the abusers had been locked in federal cages, and the absolute truth had finally eradicated their suffocating lies. The sterile, humming fluorescent lights of the county jail visitation center cast a sickly pale glow over the cracked linoleum floor. Naomi sat perfectly still in the hard plastic chair, staring straight ahead at the thick, smudged plexiglass divider. She did not feel the paralyzing anxiety that used to choke her lungs whenever she anticipated Logan's anger. Her pulse remained remarkably steady and calm. A heavy metal door groaned open on the opposite side of the partition. A uniformed guard escorted Logan into the small, confined booth. He wore a stiff, bright orange county jumpsuit, a stark and humiliating contrast to his usual array of tailored Italian suits and expensive silk ties. His wrists were secured in heavy metal cuffs attached to a thick belly chain. The guard unhooked his hands, allowing him to pull out the metal stool and sit down. Logan snatched the black plastic telephone handset from the wall cradle with aggressive, impatient force. Naomi picked up her receiver, holding it to her ear. Logan did not offer an apology or show a single ounce of remorse for his violent actions at the cabin. He immediately went on the offensive. He leaned close to the glass, his face twisted in a familiar, entitled sneer. He barked a direct order, demanding to know why he was still sitting in a filthy holding cell. He commanded Naomi to immediately contact his father. He instructed her to tell Mitchell to deploy his absolute best corporate defense attorneys to the precinct and post his bail before the afternoon shift change. Logan arrogantly proclaimed that the trespassing and assault charges were pathetic, baseless accusations that would be entirely dismissed by a judge within 10 minutes of a proper legal intervention. He slammed his palm against the metal counter, ordering his wife to stop staring at him like a useless statue and follow his exact instructions. He confidently threatened to ruin the careers of every arresting officer who had dared to put their hands on him, utterly convinced that his family's immense wealth and towering social status made him completely untouchable by the local justice system. He leaned back on the uncomfortable stool, crossing his arms over his chest, fully expecting Naomi to cower, apologize, and frantically obey his commands, just as she had done for nearly a decade. Naomi did not break eye contact. She did not shrink under his aggressive tone or apologize for his current incarceration. She maintained a chilling, absolute composure that deeply unsettled the man sitting across from her. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, neatly organized stack of legal documents. She did not bring a message from his father or the contact information for an elite defense attorney. She slid the heavy stack of paperwork through the narrow metal security slot at the base of the thick plexiglass window. The papers landed on Logan's side of the counter with a soft, definitive slide. She calmly instructed him to read the top page. Logan frowned, his arrogant facade slipping into mild confusion. He picked up the first document, expecting to see a bail bond receipt or a standard police report. He looked down at the bold, undeniable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stamped across the header. Naomi kept her voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth or sympathy. She informed him that his father was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, completely stripped of his assets and his counterfeit empire. She coldly explained the results of the massive forensic audit, detailing the elaborate decades-long Ponzi scheme Mitchell had orchestrated to fund their lavish lifestyle. Logan's eyes widened, racing across the typed paragraphs detailing wire fraud, money laundering, and grand embezzlement. Naomi leaned slightly closer to the glass. She delivered the ultimate devastating reality of his situation. She told Logan to look at the name listed as the sole legal director of the fraudulent offshore holding accounts. Logan flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to tremble violently. His own signature, meticulously forged by his father, stared back at him. Naomi explained that Mitchell had intentionally constructed the entire illegal network to bypass his own liability and lead federal prosecutors straight to his son. The man Logan worshipped, the powerful titan he believed would rescue him, had actively set him up as the primary fall guy for a massive federal crime. Naomi clearly stated the mathematical consequence of his father's ultimate betrayal. Logan was officially listed as the prime suspect in a massive financial terrorism case. He was no longer facing a simple local assault charge. He was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The heavy, undeniable truth of the federal indictment crushed Logan with the force of a collapsing building. The impenetrable armor of his extreme arrogance evaporated in a matter of seconds. The realization that his own father had viewed him as a completely disposable asset, a sacrificial pawn, meant to absorb decades of criminal liability shattered his mind. He dropped the paperwork onto the metal counter. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His breathing turned ragged and shallow, escalating into a full, uncontrollable panic attack. Logan slammed his fists violently against the thick plexiglass window, but the reinforced barrier did not even rattle. He pressed his face against the cold, transparent surface, his features contorted in sheer, unadulterated terror. Tears streamed down his cheeks, soaking the collar of his orange jumpsuit. He gripped the black telephone handset with both hands, sobbing openly and desperately into the receiver. He begged Naomi to help him, pleading with her to speak to Gerald, to use her father's immense wealth to hire a legal team and save him from the federal prosecutors. He promised to change his behavior frantically, swearing to attend therapy, be a better father to Leo, and do whatever she demanded if she just provided a way out of his impending, decades-long imprisonment. He wailed that he was innocent, a victim of his father's manipulation, desperately trying to elicit a single shred of the empathy he had abused for years. Naomi listened to his pathetic, broken sobbing through the plastic earpiece. She looked at the man who had controlled her life through fear, intimidation, and financial terrorism. She felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no lingering affection, no desire to rescue him from the grave his father had dug. The heavy psychological chains that had bound her to him for nearly a decade were permanently severed. Naomi did not utter a single word of comfort or closure. She simply pulled the telephone receiver away from her ear and placed it firmly back onto the metal wall cradle, cutting off his frantic begging mid-sentence. She stood up from the hard plastic chair, smoothed the fabric of her coat, and turned her back on the glass. She walked with steady, purposeful steps out of the visitation room and pushed through the heavy exit doors, leaving Logan screaming silently into the void. The heavy oak doors of the county family courthouse swung open, disrupting the thick, oppressive silence of the courtroom. 2 armed bailiffs escorted Logan down the center aisle. The man who had once dominated elite corporate boardrooms in tailored Italian silk now shuffled forward in a stiff, brightly colored prison jumpsuit. Heavy steel chains clanked against the polished hardwood floor, binding his wrists to his waist and shackling his ankles. His previously immaculate hair hung greasy and unkempt across his forehead, casting dark shadows over his hollow, exhausted eyes. The absolute humiliation of his public downfall radiated from every rigid step he took toward the respondent's table. He was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was a federal inmate awaiting trial, completely stripped of the artificial wealth that had shielded his cruelty for a decade. Naomi sat tall and perfectly composed at the petitioner's table. She wore a sharp-structured charcoal blazer, her posture reflecting an unbreakable inner strength she had reclaimed from the ashes of her marriage. She did not shrink into her chair or avert her eyes when Logan was forced into the seat just a few yards away. She looked directly at the man who had terrorized her, feeling absolutely no fear. Beside her sat Jonathan, his heavy leather briefcase resting on the table, completely prepared to deliver the final lethal blow to Logan's remaining parental rights. My daughter had completely shed the psychological chains of her abuser. She was now a fierce, uncompromising protector standing between her son and the monsters who had hurt him. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery. I wore a simple dark suit, my hands resting calmly on my knees. I did not need to sit at the front table to assert my presence. My silent adjustment had already set the entire legal execution into motion. I watched Logan cast a desperate, venomous glare in my direction, silently blaming me for the cold steel cutting into his wrists. I did not react. I held his gaze with cold, absolute indifference, letting him drown in the realization that his empire was entirely gone. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, demanding everyone rise. The presiding judge took her seat at the high wooden bench, adjusting her glasses and opening the thick file containing the undeniable truth of the fraudulent family. The battle for Leo's future officially commenced. Jonathan did not waste a single second on theatrical legal arguments or emotional appeals. He operated with the ruthless, mechanical precision of a surgeon excising a malignant tumor. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the judge's bench with a meticulously organized binder of irrefutable evidence. He began by placing the medical records directly into the public record. He submitted the high-resolution hospital x-rays detailing the exact nature of the injuries sustained during the violent altercation at the emergency clinic. The stark black and white images provided undeniable biological proof of physical abuse. Jonathan then directed the court's attention to a large digital monitor positioned next to the witness stand. With a single click of a remote, he played the security footage recovered from the clinic's exterior cameras. The silent video clearly displayed Mitchell violently grabbing Leo aggressively, forcing the terrified 9-year-old child toward a waiting luxury vehicle, while Logan stood idly by, fully enabling the assault. The judge watched the screen with a deeply hardened expression, her pen stopping completely on her legal pad. The visual evidence eradicated any possibility of Logan claiming ignorance or defending his father's actions. He was caught on high-definition video, actively facilitating the endangerment of his own flesh and blood. To permanently seal the legal coffin, Jonathan introduced the massive stack of federal indictments that currently held Logan and Mitchell behind bars. He methodically outlined the staggering scope of the multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He highlighted the forged incorporation documents definitively proving that Mitchell had manipulated the corporate structure to frame his own son for massive financial fraud. Jonathan explicitly connected the financial terrorism to Logan's complete unfitness as a parent, demonstrating that the family's entire existence was built on extreme criminal deception. He argued that exposing a child to such a volatile, dangerous, and criminally compromised environment constituted severe negligence. Logan's court-appointed defense attorney sat completely motionless. Stripped of his massive stolen wealth, Logan could not afford the ruthless corporate sharks his father usually employed. The overworked public defender possessed absolutely no counter-evidence to offer. There were no character witnesses willing to testify on Logan's behalf, no hidden bank accounts to leverage, and no legal loopholes to exploit. The defense table remained entirely silent, entirely suffocated under the crushing weight of the undeniable truth. Logan stared blankly at the digital monitor, watching his own inaction play on an endless loop, fully comprehending that his parental rights were completely obliterated. The judge closed the heavy manila folder and folded her hands tightly on the polished wooden desk. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and heavy, devoid of any lingering debate or legal maneuvering. She looked directly down at Logan, her expression radiating intense judicial disgust. She stated clearly for the official record that in all her years presiding over family disputes, she had rarely witnessed such a comprehensive and appalling display of physical, emotional, and financial endangerment. She condemned Logan's blatant failure to protect his child from his grandfather's violence and highlighted the staggering criminal indictments as definitive proof of a deeply unstable and hazardous environment. She declared Logan fundamentally permanently unfit to exercise any form of parental authority. With a swift, uncompromising tone, the judge delivered her final ruling. She granted Naomi immediate sole legal and physical custody of Leo. She permanently revoked all of Logan's visitation rights, stripping him of any future claim to the child's upbringing, medical decisions, or educational welfare. The judge did not stop at simply severing custody. She authorized a sweeping permanent restraining order against Logan Mitchell Patricia and any associates acting on their behalf. The legal mandate strictly prohibited them from coming within 500 yards of Naomi Leo, my cabin, or Leo's school. The mandate carried an automatic penalty of immediate federal incarceration for a single violation. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. The sound finalized the absolute legal destruction of Logan's control. The violent grip he had maintained over his wife and son was permanently shattered. The bailiff stepped forward instantly, grabbing Logan by his upper arms. They hauled the defeated man out of his chair and dragged his chained body back toward the heavy steel holding doors. He did not scream or beg this time. He simply vanished into the dark corridor, completely erased from Naomi's life. Naomi stood up from the petitioner's table. She let out a long, slow breath, releasing nearly a decade of suffocating fear and manufactured anxiety from her lungs. She gathered her coat and turned toward the back of the room. I stepped out of the gallery and met my daughter in the center aisle. She wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, burying her face against my suit jacket. The tears that fell were tears of absolute freedom. The war was officially over. The sprawling federal courtroom felt entirely different from the intimate family court where Logan had met his ruin. The polished mahogany panels and the towering judicial bench projected the absolute unyielding power of the United States government. Mitchell sat at the defense table looking like a pale shadow of the arrogant titan who had once mocked my flannel shirts. His defense team had clearly instructed him to abandon his expensive Italian suits. He wore a slightly oversized drab gray blazer and a muted tie deliberately designed to make him appear frail, diminished, and entirely non-threatening. His high-priced defense attorney, a man accustomed to spinning complex financial crimes into mere misunderstandings, approached the jury box with a practiced expression of deep sympathy. The lawyer painted a completely fabricated narrative of a confused, aging patriarch who had simply lost control of a rapidly expanding real estate empire. He argued that the missing millions were not the result of malicious theft or a calculated Ponzi scheme, but rather a tragic series of innocent accounting errors compounded by an unstable global market. He tried to convince the 12 men and women in the jury box that Mitchell was a victim of his own unchecked ambition and failing cognitive health, not a criminal mastermind. Mitchell then took the witness stand, executing a theatrical performance that he had clearly rehearsed for weeks. He slumped his shoulders and allowed his hands to tremble visibly as he gripped the edges of the wooden enclosure. When his attorney gently questioned him about the vanished offshore accounts and the ruined investors, Mitchell forced his eyes to well with tears. He produced a crisp white handkerchief and dabbed at his face, producing a series of pathetic broken sobs. He cried out that he had only ever wanted to build a legacy for his family, claiming he loved his son and would never intentionally put him in harm's way. He looked directly at the jury, attempting to project the image of a broken, remorseful grandfather begging for a shred of mercy. I sat in the front row of the gallery, watching his performance with absolute disgust. His tears were entirely manufactured, a final, desperate manipulation tactic from a narcissist who realized his charm was no longer working. The jury watched him closely, their faces unreadable, carefully evaluating the desperate display of a man fighting to avoid dying in a federal cage. The prosecution called their primary witness right after the afternoon recess. I stood up, buttoned my dark custom-tailored suit jacket, and walked past the defense table with measured, deliberate steps. I did not spare Mitchell a single glance as I took the stand and swore to tell the absolute truth. The federal prosecutor immediately established my credentials, presenting the documentation that officially named me as the founder and chairman of Vanguard Apex Holdings. I was legally recognized as the majority owner and the primary defrauded creditor of Mitchell's liquidated firm. My testimony was not fueled by theatrical emotion or dramatic outrage. I spoke with sharp surgical precision, systematically dismantling the defense's pathetic narrative of a confused, failing old man. I detailed the exact chronological timeline of Mitchell's elaborate corporate deception. I explained how Vanguard's forensic auditors had traced the flow of stolen capital through a complex web of dummy corporations and offshore accounts. I provided the court with the specific dates, routing numbers, and exact dollar amounts that Mitchell had siphoned from private investors to fund his extravagant personal lifestyle. When the prosecutor asked about the forged incorporation documents, I delivered the final, undeniable truth. I clearly explained that the legal structure of the embezzlement was not a careless mistake. It was a highly sophisticated, intentionally weaponized firewall designed to completely insulate Mitchell from any federal prosecution. I directed the jury to the signature lines on the offshore holding contracts. I stated unequivocally that Mitchell had meticulously and repeatedly forged his own son's physical and digital signatures. He had knowingly constructed the fraudulent empire so that if the authorities ever breached the accounts, the legal paper trail would bypass him entirely and send Logan to a maximum security prison. The courtroom fell completely silent as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over the gallery. I looked directly at the jury, my voice cold and uncompromising. I told them that the man sitting at the defense table was not a victim of failing health or poor accounting. He was a ruthless, calculating apex predator who possessed zero loyalty to anyone completely willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to protect his stolen wealth. Mitchell stared down at his legal pad, his face flushed with deep, humiliated rage. He knew my testimony had permanently destroyed his carefully crafted illusion. There was no defense left to mount. The closing arguments wrapped up the following morning, and the federal judge formally handed the case over to the jury. Complex financial fraud trials often resulted in days or even weeks of agonizing deliberation as jurors struggled to untangle massive corporate ledgers. This jury deliberated for barely 2 hours. The incredibly swift return signaled absolute certainty. The bailiff called the courtroom to order as the 12 men and women filed back into the box. The heavy, oppressive tension in the room was suffocating. Mitchell stood up next to his high-priced attorney, his hands trembling visibly. The performative frailty he had showcased earlier in the week was gone, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. The jury foreperson handed the folded verdict sheet to the bailiff, who passed it up to the presiding judge. The judge reviewed the document in complete silence, her face an unreadable mask of judicial authority. She handed it back to the clerk to be read into the official record. The clerk's voice rang out clear and sharp across the silent room. On the charges of massive federal wire fraud, guilty. On the charges of aggravated embezzlement, guilty. On the charges of systemic money laundering and corporate forgery, guilty. Mitchell collapsed heavily into his wooden chair as the word echoed off the mahogany walls. The judge did not delay the sentencing phase, having previously reviewed the comprehensive pre-sentencing reports. She looked down at Mitchell with a gaze devoid of any sympathy or leniency. She stated that his decades of deception had ruined countless lives, bankrupted trusting investors, and demonstrated a profound, irredeemable lack of basic human morality. She noted that his deliberate attempt to frame his own son for his crimes was one of the most calculating and despicable acts of self-preservation she had ever encountered in her courtroom. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, final crack. She sentenced Mitchell to a mandatory 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. She explicitly ordered that the sentence be served entirely without the possibility of parole. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Mitchell by the arms and hauling him away. He did not cry or beg this time. He was completely hollowed out, a ghost of a man being dragged into the dark. I stood up, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt clean and sharp. The rot had finally been excised. Justice had been served cold. The federal government moved with swift, unrelenting efficiency following the guilty verdict, immediately initiating the total asset forfeiture of Mitchell's vast, fraudulent empire. A highly coordinated task force descended upon the sprawling suburban estate, treating the property not as a home but as a massive crime scene loaded with stolen goods. Federal agents methodically cataloged every single item of value within the mansion walls. They emptied the walk-in closets, bagging rows of custom-tailored suits, designer dresses, and rare fur coats. A specialized team cracked the heavy steel wall safes, confiscating velvet-lined trays overflowing with diamond necklaces, imported luxury watches, and heavy gold bullion. The fleet of high-performance European sports cars parked in the pristine, temperature-controlled garage was unceremoniously hauled away by a parade of heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks. The government seized the mansion itself, slapping bright orange eviction notices across the shattered mahogany front doors before listing the property on the federal auction block. Within weeks, the entire accumulation of the family's counterfeit wealth was liquidated to the highest bidders in sterile, bureaucratic auction houses. The millions of dollars generated from the sale of the luxury vehicles, the extravagant jewelry, and the sprawling real estate were systematically funneled into a massive federal victim compensation fund. I utilized my position at Vanguard Apex Holdings to quietly oversee the complex distribution process, ensuring that the working-class families and unsuspecting investors Mitchell had mercilessly defrauded received their stolen capital back with interest. Mitchell had spent a lifetime building an impenetrable monument to his own greed, carefully constructing a flawless public image designed to intimidate and dominate those he considered beneath him. The federal liquidation completely erased that monument from the earth. There was no inheritance left to salvage, no hidden offshore accounts to access, and no secret trust funds to exploit. The government legally stripped the family of their name, their status, and their future, leaving behind absolutely nothing but a hollow, shameful legacy of criminal deceit. Patricia dragged a single, scuffed synthetic suitcase across the cracked asphalt of a dimly lit parking lot on the extreme outskirts of the city. She had been abruptly expelled from her seized mansion with only the clothes on her back and whatever minor personal items the federal agents deemed legally exempt from the forfeiture order. The massive frozen bank accounts and the total liquidation of her assets left her entirely destitute. She pushed open the heavy dented door of a cheap roadside motel, gagging at the overwhelming stench of stale cigarette smoke, mildew, and cheap chemical disinfectant. She paid for a week's stay using the last handful of crumpled cash she possessed, accepting a rusted brass key from a completely apathetic clerk behind a bulletproof glass partition. Her new reality was a cramped, dingy room featuring peeling yellow wallpaper, a sagging mattress covered in a faded synthetic bedspread, and a constantly dripping bathroom faucet. As she sat on the edge of the hard bed, a large cockroach scurried brazenly across the stained linoleum floor, highlighting the absolute squalor of her new existence. The pressing, undeniable need to survive forced her out of the motel the very next morning to secure manual labor. Stripped of her elite social standing and lacking any actual marketable skills, Patricia was forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position at a massive industrial laundromat. She traded her emerald green silk pajamas and cashmere coats for a stiff, ill-fitting polyester uniform. Her daily existence transformed into a brutal, exhausting nightmare of physical labor. She stood for 10 to 12 hours a day on a hard, unforgiving concrete floor in a suffocatingly hot, windowless warehouse. The deafening roar of massive industrial washing machines constantly assaulted her ears. Her hands, previously softened by weekly expensive manicures, quickly blistered, cracked, and bled as she continuously folded hundreds of coarse, bleach-soaked hotel towels. She spent her entire day inhaling thick, chemical-heavy steam, destroying her body for a meager paycheck that barely covered her weekly rent and a few cans of cheap, heavily processed soup. The physical agony of the industrial laundromat was utterly eclipsed by the crushing, suffocating psychological isolation Patricia endured every night in her miserable motel room. She sat on the sagging mattress under the flickering glow of a broken neon sign outside her window, clutching a cheap plastic prepaid cell phone. She desperately scrolled through her digital contact list, staring at the names of the wealthy, elite women who had routinely attended her lavish dinner parties drank her expensive imported champagne, and gleefully joined her in mocking the working class. She desperately swallowed her massive pride, dialed the first number, and prayed for a temporary financial lifeline. The call rang twice before going straight to an automated voicemail. She dialed another prominent country club associate, then a local socialite, and then the wife of a powerful corporate executive. Every single call was immediately rejected or diverted to an answering machine. The high society circle she had ruthlessly guarded and worshipped had instantly and permanently exiled her. She was entirely radioactive, a disgraced, penniless pariah permanently tied to a nationally televised federal scandal. No one wanted to be associated with the wife of a convicted felon serving 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Patricia left a series of pathetic, weeping voicemails begging her former friends for a small personal loan, a temporary place to stay, or simply a 5-minute conversation. Not a single person returned her calls. The heavy, oppressive silence of the dingy motel room pressed down on her chest, completely shattering her fragile ego. She finally realized the devastating truth about her entire existence. She had absolutely no real friends, no genuine connections, and no actual family left. The people she had surrounded herself with were simply parasites drawn to the artificial warmth of stolen wealth. Patricia dropped the cheap plastic phone onto the stained carpet and buried her face in her blistered, cracking hands. She was now permanently trapped in the exact crushing poverty, absolute social insignificance, and agonizing isolation she had spent her entire privileged life ruthlessly mocking and weaponizing against others. The morning sun glared off the polished hood of the heavy town car as I navigated the dense, aggressive city traffic. Naomi sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the tinted window at the towering concrete and glass structures dominating the financial district. She still carried the deep emotional exhaustion of the past few weeks, but the trembling, suffocating fear that had once dictated her every movement was completely gone. I steered the heavy vehicle into a private subterranean parking garage beneath a massive, imposing skyscraper. 2 heavily armed private security guards immediately stepped forward, recognized my face through the windshield, and stepped back to clear the path. I parked in a reserved executive spot and motioned for Naomi to follow me. We walked together toward a set of reinforced steel elevator doors. I swiped a black cryptographic keycard across the biometric scanner, and the heavy doors slid open instantly. We rode in absolute silence to the top floor, the sudden acceleration pressing us slightly into the floor. The elevator chimed, softly opening into a sprawling, immaculate reception area, framed by massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline. A polished mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by sleek leather chairs and modern aggressive artwork. The frosted glass double doors behind the reception desk bore the imposing silver crest of Vanguard Apex Holdings. Naomi stopped in the center of the foyer, her eyes wide as she took in the sheer, overwhelming scale of the operation. Dozens of sharply dressed analysts and ruthless corporate attorneys moved briskly through the wide corridors, carrying thick financial dossiers and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She turned to look at me, her expression a mixture of profound shock and newfound understanding. For her entire adult life, she had firmly believed Mitchell controlled the absolute pinnacle of wealth and corporate dominance. She had watched Logan strut around in expensive suits, bragging about a fraudulent empire built entirely on stolen money and thin air. Standing in the nerve center of Vanguard, she finally grasped the staggering magnitude of genuine, untouchable power. This was not a fragile house of cards propped up by deceit and manipulation. This was a concrete fortress of legitimate global finance, and I was the undisputed architect who had built every single level of it. I placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her through the frosted glass doors, leading her directly into my private corner office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, severing the low hum of the corporate machinery outside. Naomi stood near the center of the expansive office, her gaze sweeping over the panoramic view of the bustling city below. She took a deep, steadying breath and turned to face me. She began to speak with a rushed, nervous energy, rapidly outlining her plans for the immediate future. She mentioned securing a new house for Leo in a quiet, highly rated neighborhood, enrolling him in a prestigious private academy, and hiring a team of contractors to manage the impending transition. She looked at me with an expectant, hopeful expression, clearly anticipating that I would simply open a drawer, pull out a checkbook, and write a blank check to finance this fresh start. She assumed that my vast, newly revealed resources meant her financial struggles were permanently and effortlessly resolved. I walked slowly around the edge of my heavy oak desk and stopped a few feet away from her. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered a harsh, incredibly necessary truth. I told her I would absolutely not fund her new life. Naomi froze, the hopeful smile vanishing instantly from her face. Deep confusion washed over her features as she struggled to process the sudden rejection. She reminded me of the billions of dollars flowing through the company, questioning why I would withhold a tiny fraction of that wealth when she had just narrowly escaped a decade of intense psychological torture and physical threat. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of pity. I explained that simply handing her millions of dollars would not solve the root of her problem. It would only replace one dangerous financial dependency with another. Logan had controlled her by weaponizing his access to money, forcing her into absolute terrified submission because she possessed no independent resources or financial literacy to fight back. If I gave her a massive cash settlement today, I would be depriving her of the exact strength she desperately needed to survive in a brutal world. She would remain a passive passenger in her own life, comfortable but entirely defenseless against the next predator who recognized her vulnerability. I reminded her that true power could not be gifted, inherited, or handed over through a simple bank transfer. It had to be earned through relentless effort, brutal discipline, and a thorough understanding of how the world actually operated. I was not going to give her a golden parachute. I was going to give her something far more valuable and permanent. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a small, rectangular object attached to a thick black lanyard. I walked back around the desk and held it out to her. Naomi stared down at my outstretched hand. It was a standard employee identification badge, completely blank, except for the Vanguard Apex Holdings logo and the title of Junior Financial Analyst printed clearly at the bottom. I told her that she was going to start at the absolute bottom of the corporate hierarchy. She would learn how to read complex market data, analyze fluctuating asset portfolios, and identify the exact type of financial deception her father-in-law had used to destroy so many trusting lives. She would work agonizingly long hours answering to strict, unforgiving managers who did not care about her personal trauma or her biological relation to the chairman of the board. I promised her that the work would be exhausting, frustrating, and relentlessly demanding. But I also promised that every single dollar she earned would belong entirely and legally to her. She would slowly build an impenetrable armor of financial intelligence, forging herself into a ruthless woman who could never be manipulated, coerced, or financially starved by a man like Logan ever again. She would learn to protect her own wealth and secure Leo's future with her own two hands. Naomi looked from the plastic badge to my face. The initial shock of my refusal completely melted away rapidly, replaced by a fierce, undeniable clarity. She finally understood the true magnitude of the gift I was offering. I was not offering her a comfortable escape from reality. I was offering her the precise tools to become an apex predator in her own right. She reached out with a steady hand and took the lanyard from my grasp. She slipped the thick black strap over her head, letting the identification badge rest proudly against the lapel of her structured charcoal blazer. She stood slightly taller, her shoulders squaring as she fully embraced the heavy, necessary responsibility. A sharp, determined smile broke across her face, radiating a dangerous new confidence that mirrored my own. She looked me dead in the eye and asked exactly what time she needed to report for her first shift tomorrow morning. The helpless victim who had cowered in my cabin was officially dead. The true successor to my empire had finally arrived. The golden sunlight of a late Sunday afternoon spilled across the wooden planks of my front porch, casting long, warm shadows against the heavy log cabin. The oppressive, manufactured chaos that had plagued our lives for the past year was entirely gone, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of the forest. The gravel driveway remained perfectly still, completely free from the screeching tires of luxury vehicles and the violent demands of arrogant men. I sat on the top step, the rough denim of my jeans brushing against the worn wood. Leo sat directly beside me, his small hands covered in dark, heavy machine grease. An old, rusted bicycle rested upside down between us on a thick canvas drop cloth. The chain had seized up from years of neglect, locked tight by corrosion and dirt. I held a steel wrench in my right hand, demonstrating the precise angle needed to loosen the rear axle nut without stripping the heavy metal threading. I did not raise my voice or issue sharp, demeaning commands. I spoke in a low, steady cadence, explaining the mechanics of the machine and the simple necessity of patience. Leo listened with absolute, unbroken concentration. He gripped a small bottle of industrial lubricating oil, waiting for my exact signal to apply the fluid to the stiff metal links. He leaned closer, his eyes tracking every slight adjustment I made to the gears. The sterile, terrifying environment of the Mitchell estate had actively punished him for being a child demanding silent perfection and treating his natural curiosity as a punishable offense. Here, surrounded by the towering pines and the smell of raw earth, he was allowed to get his hands dirty. He was permitted to make mistakes, to ask questions, and to learn how to rebuild something broken with his own two hands. I guided his fingers over the rear derailleur, showing him how to align the gears so the chain could finally catch. The heavy scent of pine needles and engine oil hung in the warm air, grounding us in the absolute reality of the present moment. There were no hidden agendas on this porch, no financial traps, and no manipulative psychological games. There was only the simple, honest work of putting a broken machine back together. Leo applied the oil exactly as instructed, pressing his thumb against the nozzle with careful precision. I tightened the final bolt, feeling the cold steel lock securely into place. The fundamental foundation of a child's confidence was being restored one metal link at a time. I instructed Leo to grab the pedal and push it forward. He gripped the textured plastic and shoved it with a sudden burst of energy. The oiled chain snapped perfectly onto the metal teeth of the gear, spinning the rear wheel with a smooth, rhythmic hum. Leo let out a loud, sudden burst of laughter. It was a bright, uninhibited sound that echoed freely across the quiet clearing. I watched his face closely, noting the absolute absence of the pervasive fear that had once defined his entire existence. He did not immediately shrink back or look over his shoulder, expecting a sharp reprimand for making too much noise. The dark, heavy bags under his eyes had completely vanished, and the rigid, defensive posture he used to carry had softened into the natural, relaxed stance of a normal 9-year-old boy. The trauma that had initiated this catastrophic war was systematically fading into a distant memory, actively overwritten by safety and unconditional support. Through the open mesh screen of the front door, the rich aroma of roasted vegetables and seared garlic drifted out onto the porch. I looked over my shoulder and watched Naomi moving efficiently through the cabin's small kitchen. She chopped ingredients on the wooden cutting board with swift, decisive motions. She did not hesitate, and she did not second-guess her actions. The lingering, suffocating shadow of Logan's psychological control had been entirely eradicated from her mind. She wore a simple cotton sweater, but her posture retained the sharp, formidable structure of the corporate analyst she had become. She spent her weekdays navigating complex financial portfolios in the towering glass skyscraper of Vanguard Apex Holdings, ruthlessly mastering the exact fiscal mechanisms that had once been weaponized against her. She was actively building her own impenetrable fortress of wealth, guaranteeing that she would never rely on another human being for her fundamental survival. Naomi glanced through the screen door, catching my eye as Leo continued to spin the bicycle wheel with gleeful enthusiasm. She flashed a wide, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was a smile born of absolute independence and hard-won victory. She picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet, handling the weight with effortless strength. The fragile, terrified woman who had arrived at my gate in the dead of night was gone forever. In her place stood a fiercely capable mother who completely controlled her own destiny. I picked up a heavy cotton rag and wiped the thick black grease from my calloused fingers. I placed the steel wrench back into the metal toolbox, the sharp clink signaling the end of the day's labor. I stood up from the porch steps, the old wooden boards groaning softly under my boots. I walked to the edge of the railing and looked out over the vast expanse of the dense tree line. The sun was steadily sinking behind the distant mountains, igniting the sky in deep, violent shades of orange and bruised purple. The cooling evening wind swept through the pines, carrying the absolute tranquility of total victory. I looked out into the fading light and spoke silently in my mind to my late wife, Evelyn. I told her that the bloodline was entirely safe. I assured her that our daughter had grown into a terrifyingly competent protector, and that our grandson would grow up knowing how to build, how to fight, and how to survive. The counterfeit empire that had dared to threaten our family had been ripped apart at the roots, and the men who had inflicted the pain were locked away in concrete cages, stripped of their names and their stolen power. I stood in the quiet twilight, reflecting on the absolute nature of true power. Mitchell and Logan had operated under the fatal delusion that power was loud. They believed it required screaming demands, flashing stolen wealth, and physically intimidating the vulnerable to maintain control. They had fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of dominance. True power is perfectly silent. It is the relentless patience to gather irrefutable facts in the dark. It is the iron discipline required to mask your capabilities until the exact right moment. True power is the quiet, devastating execution of justice when the arrogant finally dare to cross the line. I had not needed to raise my voice or throw a single punch to annihilate their entire existence. I had simply used the truth to systematically dismantle their world. The ashes of their fraudulent legacy now fertilized the ground for our peace. I turned away from the setting sun and walked back toward the open screen door, where the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of my family's laughter waited. The conflict was completely over. Order was permanently restored. True independence is never granted freely by others. It must be forged through absolute discipline and resilience. Naomi learned that relying on someone else for financial survival creates a dangerous vulnerability, allowing predators to weaponize basic human needs. True wealth is not simply a number in a bank account, but rather the impenetrable armor of knowledge and self-reliance. By rejecting a massive cash handout and choosing to start at the bottom, she reclaimed her permanent autonomy. The ultimate victory is not merely surviving abuse, but transforming that trauma into the undeniable power to dictate your own destiny without any fear. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more tales of justice, resilience, and reclaiming power, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Naomi's journey, and subscribe to our channel for more content.